Production by郁达夫Short Stories. Confession Monologue. When I was studying in elementary school, perhaps before I entered elementary school, I remember always loving walking to the riverside a little far away from the city to play. Because there is plenty of fresh air and lush green pastures. Standing side by side with the mulberry locust trees are rows of shadows that neither begin nor end, and the sky seen from the branches of the trees always seems to be a bottomless blue. In the middle of these green and blue mountains, I remember that there were still many chirps and the screams of flying eagles that disappeared with a long and leisurely swipe to the ground. In the midst of these green and shaded yellow sandy banks, I lay down, lazily, and watched the sailboats on the river. At that time, there were no ships on the clean Xiantang River, and the smoky trees and green mountains across the river. I always had a lot to daydream about for most of the day. My fascination with nature seems to have been my nature since childhood. Later I read Pan Sheng Jernson. This peasant artist was born in 1832 and died in 1910, and was a giant of the north along with Ibsen's peasant novels. Only then did I know the youth in the Norwegian fishing village. Most of them also have this kind of nature. From this fascination with nature, a longing for the emptiness will inevitably arise. This is what the Germans call Sehnsucht nach der Ferne. From this longing for space, a feeling of traveling far away, what the Germans call Wanderlust, will inevitably brew. After thinking about it, these three factors are probably the main motivations that make me want to pick up a pen and write something. Because I feel dissatisfied with reality, I want to escape back to the embrace of nature, wander in the vastness of nature, and just want to fly away. But after arriving at a fixed place, the psychological changes are the same. It got up, so it kept turning around. He can only be a slave of wanderlust throughout his life and become an eternal traveler, an eternal pilgrim. The inner experience and external influences before and after this. I have written about this in the preface to the single volume of The Sinking, and in the article, Review of the Creative Life in the Past 5 or 6 Years, at the beginning of the Past collection, so I don't need to mention it here. Let me talk about the origins of my subsequent ups and downs of mood and my current silence. However, Bastille's prison finally broke, and many young people like me who were in the same claustrophobic state rushed out. With the sound of a thunderbolt, the whole world responded, the National Revolution is successful. The National Revolution is successful. But in turn, young people are unlucky. The revolution has failed. Thousands of young people who were freed from prison only made a joyful performance. Nightmare. The result was no different from the slaves under the Roman Empire. They were chained by the feet and hands in the same manner. They had to carry stones and beams to the hot sun every day. They were said to be the holy and supreme man with great achievements in hard work. Augustus wanted to build a palace. Build a deer platform. No one dares to disobey an order, because standing next to them as supervisors are all ferocious guards holding whips on their left and broadaxes on their right. If you are a little slow in moving rocks and beams, it will naturally be as light as a whip or as serious as an axe. Who will reason with you? In this state of hard labor after being released from prison, I have become old, my strength has gone, my throat has become hoarse, I can't move, and I can still stretch out my hand and pick up a pen. The sentence of exile has finally expired, with a full of enthusiasm for my diploma, I returned to my homeland where superiors and subordinates competed for profits, and then I saw no one at all, which means, there are few people and many beasts. Hitting the wall, hitting the wall, hitting the wall again, a traveler who had just returned from exile was pardoned. But I have forever stepped into the prison of a homeland without bars. Only then did I fully understand the golden words of a British satirist, life is a prison without bar. There is no way out of sorrow. When I picked up a pen to write, I had no choice but to write some cynical, blaming complaints, and a few wild rants that would destroy everything and knock everything down. The more this happens, the harder it is to find a way out. The less you can find a way out, the more you want to destroy and resist. The works in the middle of this issue. Most of them were written in this mood. Therefore, when I wrote The Sinking, there was no trace of reluctance at all emotionally. I just felt that I had to write it, and I also felt that I could only write it like this, and there was no skill or skill. Words and sentences are ignored, just like when a person feels pain, he has to scream. How can he care whether the scream is a low tone or a high tone? Or does it harmonize with the sounds of the musical instruments playing nearby? Life from 18 to 19 years old will always go through a romantic and lyrical era. At this time, even a mute bird that cannot speak has to open its throat to sing, let alone a human being with rich emotions. My lyrical era was one of desolation and cruelty. I lived in an island country under the dictatorship of a warlord. The sight of Lu Chen in his homeland, the humiliation he suffered in a foreign land, everything he felt and thought about, and experienced with his husband, all together, there was no disappointment, no sadness, just like a young woman who had lost her husband for the first time. With no strength, no courage, and a lot of sorrow, it was the volume, The Sinking, that aroused a lot of criticism at that time. I have been silent for many years, and I have long wanted to stop doing this kind of empty business that is useless to the world and useless to myself. However, my friend decided that I should write something about my experience in creative life, so I decided to make one more confession before I starved to death. Be eager to learn what Goethe said when he was dying, Mehr, Licht. Mehr, Licht. More bright. More light. After half a lifetime of hard work, we will just talk about it. The future disaster will be like this. This is a spring festival couplet written by one of my relatives, Mr. Wang, before he died on New Year's Day this year. It is just appropriate to put it here as a tale. December 1931. Originally published in Beidou Volume 1, Issue 4, December 20th, 1931. A lightly snowy morning. This man is no longer in the world, and the cause of his death has not yet been understood. His face is very delicate. Not like a northerner. When I first met him in the classroom, I always thought he was a student from Jiangsu and Zhejiang. Later, listening to the tone of his conversation with his husband, I found out that he was from Beizili. I lived with him in the school boarding house for 2 months. I met him many times in the library, and one Saturday afternoon, we went out to Zibiaman for a mule ride with him, and then I found out that he was from the countryside of Jingzhou, only 18 miles away from the capital. The son of a farmer from Yinjiaji. After graduating from Beijing Normal University, I was admitted to this normal university. We hired a foreign cart and rode outside Yongding Gate. From Yongding Gate we hired a donkey cart to go to Yinjiaji. There are very few pedestrians on the road, and the fields are vast. There are only a few clusters of dead woods dotting the loneliness of the winter suburbs. The snowflakes were getting bigger one after another, and the wild scenery on all sides was indistinct. Looking through the gap in the hood of the car, it seemed as if it was covered with a layer of gauze. Fortunately, our car was heading south and the north wind was not blowing. But there were a lot of snow flakes on the donkey's back, and the melting heat stole into the carriage one by one. It looked like the donkey was sweating there. That morning was very cold, and at noon, the sun was still hiding in the gray clouds, just after lunch. I packed my luggage and was about to hire a car to go out when snowflakes like goose feathers began to fall in the cold sky. Another 2 months passed like this, and the north wind gradually became stronger, and the residents in the capital also felt the force of the cold. The exams started in our school, and at the end of December in the lunar calendar, we had the annual vacation. This is also something that makes me admire his indifference, because I usually see him working there blindly. However, when he talked about the politics and social bad habits of the time, he was impassioned and his words were pertinent and powerful, unlike a scholar. Especially regarding current affairs, his discussions were very fierce, and he scolded those warlords and bureaucrats vividly. Speaking of this family named Shen, I still suspect that their daughter was the biggest cause of my classmate's death. The Chen family is a wealthy farmer in the Yin family, with more than 200 hectares of land. The house is also a tiled house, with large walls in front and back of the house. They have 3 sons. The eldest is a daughter. She is 19 years old this year, 2 years younger than my classmate. I stayed with him at his house for 9 days, but half of the time was spent at Chen's house. The old man from the Chen family is about the same age as my classmate's father. But after marrying twice, both of them were dead. The first wife gave birth to a daughter, and the second wife gave birth to 3 boys, the eldest of whom was only 11 years old. After this suburban parade, our friendship took another step forward. During class, he sat in front of me, and I sat in the row behind him. Of course, we entered and exited in the same row. The dormitory was originally 2 rooms apart, but he negotiated with one of my roommates and actually moved here privately. In the library, of course together. But there was no way to move the study room together, so the 2 of us couldn't be together only when we were studying alone. Daily classes are generally fixed. Normally, we all get up at 6:30, take books to the playground and read for an hour. Class begins after breakfast. After lunch, I read the half-o'clock newspaper. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, after class, I go to the library to read. I studied by myself for 2 hours in the evening, washed my face, went to the dormitory to chat for a while, and then went to bed. Since I lived with him, I feel that my interest has become much better. I also studied more vigorously. On the morning of the 5th day of the first lunar month, the weather was very good. His father went to the family named Chen in front of us and borrowed a mule and cart to take us into the city. One morning in the second week after I arrived at school, I got up early. A man is reading English in the playground. When I finished reading a section and was quietly flipping through the untaught parts at the back, I suddenly felt as if there was someone standing behind me. Looking back, I saw him smiling and taking a book. Standing behind me, no more than 2 feet away from the wall, he looked at me. When I turned back to look at him, he said to me at the same time, "You work really hard." I blushed at what he said, so I had to smile and said to him, "You work very hard too." I talked for most of the day. I forgot his name and haven't told him yet. His surname is Zhu and his given name is Yaru. The titles in our school were originally called by first name and surname. Everyone called him Zhu Yaru and Zhu Yaru, but when he called people, he always didn't include his name and only called him by his surname. Add the word at the bottom. Therefore, he never calls me Li Juamin by his first name, but calls me Li Jun. I couldn't get used to it at first and felt a little embarrassed. Later I imitated him and called him Zhu Jun and Zhu Jun. My classmates and Huiying from the Chen family. This is her name. When she was young, she studied in a private school, when she grew up, she went to the primary school in Shiguantan. This Shiguan village is located 7 or 8 miles north of Yinqiaji. It is the first large village south of Yongding Gate. He lived in Shiguantan Primary School for 4 years and had the best grades. He always came first in the exams. So after graduation, his husband enrolled him in Beijing Normal University and asked him to continue his studies. This gentleman has passed away now, and my classmates still shed tears when they talk about him. I couldn't be more grateful. Since then, he has lived in Beijing Normal University for 4 years, and now he has entered university safely. In this village where there are few scholars, everyone respects his diligence and thrift in learning. Especially the old man of the Chen family, every time he said to his father, "I lived in middle school in Suzhou for 4 years, and of course I knew how to ride a mule." After listening to his words, I suddenly remembered the excitement of riding a mule to Tiger Hill in middle school, so I immediately agreed, I am not familiar with the geography of Beijing, so one doesn't dare to run out alone. I have lived in Beijing for 2 months, and the only places I have visited on Sundays and holidays are the 3 temples and Central Park. Because the weather was so good that day, I really wanted to go for a walk in the countryside. As soon as I saw him, I made up my mind. He shouted that sentence. At the same time, he seemed to want to run outside the city. When he saw me, he naturally made this suggestion, so the two of us walked onto the stone road leading to the school gate without waiting for a second sentence. After walking out of school, the second problem arises. Where to go? When we rode over the stone bridge and looked at the western mountain from the back of Baiyun Temple, the two of us looked at each other unknowingly, each smiled knowingly, and exclaimed at the same time. We walked out of Baiyun Temple. Because it was still early, we ran up to the pagoda of Tianning Temple in front. There were soldiers stationed in the temple and we were not allowed to enter. He went to negotiate with us, but he finally couldn't. So on the way back, he gnashed his teeth and cursed for a while, When I first arrived in Beijing, I had very few friends. When I met ordinary classmates, I felt guilty and timid, fearing that my poverty and lack of knowledge would be noticed by them, so for a week after arriving at school, I did not dare to say a word to my classmates. But for him, I felt a little affectionate in my heart, because he was sitting in the row in front of me, and I watched every move he made silently, so I felt very kind to him. A humble look. Even though he has the same silent and shy attitude as me, his heart has already resonated with him. When he told me that he would not go home for the new year, I had already seen his kindness towards me, and I felt really sorry, and now I heard what he said again. I felt even more sorry for him, so I said to him. On the avenue in the middle of Lulakang, walking a few steps towards the south facing the sunlight, he smiled and asked me, After living in his home for a year and 9 days, I saw the facts. There were 2 things that made me sad for him. The first was the unsatisfactory marriage, and the second was the poverty in his family. Among my classmates, most of the northerners went home to celebrate the new year. Only me and 2 or 3 other southerners were the only ones who were poor and homeless. His face just became duller day by day. Seeing the classmates happily packing their belongings one by one, I felt the bitter tears of mourning in my heart. He who was in the same room seemed unable to bear to leave because he saw my condition. So at noon on the day after the exam, he said to me, "But there is one thing that I am often selfishly afraid of, which is the kind of gossip among classmates that often occurs in middle school. Although his appearance is very delicate, his eyebrows are very thick and his lips are extremely thick. With a rectangular face that is not very fair, no matter who he looks like, he is always a young man with masculine beauty. If the wind comes up, I, a short southerner, will of course be at a disadvantage. But this selfish fear was never realized. One is because college students are more knowledgeable than middle school students, and the other is probably because his diligent behavior and inviolable dignity can convince everyone." After walking for a while, the car arrived at the door of his house and got off. My legs were numb from sitting cross-legged. When I walked into his home and took a look, it was very spacious inside. His father and mother liked him very much. We finished dinner under a kerosene lamp, and his wife came out to spread a quilt for me on a heated kong. Speaking of his wife, she was originally a child bride who grew up in his family. She just got married last year. Her feet were tangled very tightly, and although her appearance was not beautiful, it wasn't that bad in the countryside. But the clothes look very old-fashioned, from the perspective of us who are used to seeing urban people. Her green cotton-padded jacket and red cotton trousers that hugged her feet were really ugly. That night, I felt a little tired from swinging on the donkey cart for a long time during the day, so after dinner, I went to sleep on the kong early in the morning. I didn't know what he talked about with his parents in the back room or when he went to bed with his wife. Farmers in the north are all the same. They work hard all year round, but the results they earn are not enough to pay the government's heavy taxes. Although his family has dozens of acres of land. However, the income from these dozens of acres of land, apart from taxes, could not provide enough food for his parents and clothing for his wife and children. He is an only son, and his father is over 50 this year. The sons of farmers around him were about the same age as him. They can go to work in the fields and help the family, but he is studying alone in school. Not only can he not help his father, but he also has to withdraw pocket money from home to buy books and shopping. Only then did I see the reason why he had to cut back so much in school. Only because of this, I feel sympathy for him and I feel that his personality is noble even more. The climate in Beijing is best during this period of the year. The weather is neither cold nor hot, and the windy period has not yet arrived. The clear blue sky reflects the lush green of the distant mountains. It seems to be a normal scene in the sea. Moreover, in the afternoon of this day, after the light rain the night before, there was not a trace of dust on the road. The leaves of the acacia and elm trees on both sides had not yet fallen off, and they were green and green, which symbolized the peacefulness of the first summer. It's the 4th day of the first lunar month. The snow from last year has also melted, and he seemed very unhappy when he was facing the child bride at home every day, so I advised him to return to Beijing as soon as possible and go back to school. On the 3rd day after the holiday, he became dejected and anxious. That morning, the weather was extremely cold, so we opened our eyes, talked, and slept until about 10 o'clock before getting up. I was hungry and reading a magazine in my room, and he suddenly said to me. When we left the city, the mules were running very fast, so after walking in Baiyun Temple for a while, the sun was still very high. He told me. After leaving Zibianmen, the millet in the fields had been harvested, and there were areas where farmers were plowing and sowing, but most of the ground was still clearly empty. The short days of winter are eerie and late. Although the donkey cart was shaking violently, I fell asleep. When he shook me awake, I felt as if I was in a dream and didn't know where I was. When I opened my eyes and took a look, I felt that it was extremely dark inside the car hood. He smiled and said. But he refused to go back alone no matter what. He started talking at 10:30 and continued until lunchtime. He always wanted me to come with him before he would go back. He has a very weird temper. He is usually taciturn and refuses to change his words once he says something. I had been with him for half a year, and I knew very well that he had this stubborn and unyielding habit, so I finally agreed to go with him to spend the new year at his place. From this time on, the two of us started talking. 2 months later. Because we always read at the same table in the library, our friendship felt particularly close. One Saturday, the weather was particularly nice. The rain the night before suppressed the light dust, and the late autumn sun was warm and pleasant. At 1 o'clock in the afternoon, the husband asked for leave. After lunch, the two met in the newspaper reading room, and they said the same thing in unison, . The two of them talked and walked around. When they arrived near Zibianmen, it was almost 2 o'clock. A mule has been hired. Riding on the road to Baiyun Temple, our bodies were covered with golden sunlight, and our lungs were filled with the refreshing breath of the western mountains. The two of us felt that being emperors would not bring such happiness. Among the new classmates who entered the school, they were all arrogant young people. He was the only one with a soft appearance. He was very humble and wore a green bamboo coat. On the first day of class, he diligently took a pencil and a notebook and recorded what he said there. There are a lot of mules, and there are them as soon as you leave the city gate. I'm afraid you don't know how to ride them. This kid Yaru. He must be very promising, and you must cultivate him. If you want money, I will do my best to help you. This Baiyun Temple is where Taoist priests gather. Empress Dowager Cixi of the Qing dynasty often came here to rest. The first lunar month of every year starts from the first day of the lunar month and ends on the 18th day of the lunar month. Women from Beijing come here to burn incense and ride horses, and the road is crowded. At that time, there was an old Taoist sitting under the bridge, saying nothing and not eating all day long, saying that he had attained enlightenment. There was a row of white-haired Taoist priests sitting in the old man's hall. He had hundreds of years written on his body and defrauded women of a lot of money. This kind of behavior that confuses the public should really be banned, but the wives of the Beijing authorities still come to worship and give alms to praise their generosity. Do you think it is outrageous or not? I have to kill these bitches. Our people's children, fields and houses have all been occupied by them. One day I will take revenge on them. That's great. Li Jun, let's go. Can you go to our countryside to celebrate the new year? Li Jun, can you ride a mule? Li Jun. Wake up. Look, didn't you see a few lights in front? That's where the Yin family gathers. I know how to ride. I don't plan to go back during the annual vacation, so I can read more here. But 2 days after the exam, the library was also closed. The only two classmates left in the same room were me and him. In addition, there were no stoves in the dormitory and study room, and the lights seemed to be out. They were dormant there in a cold and gray state, and it was impossible to read. If we want to go to a game, we don't have the money. I went for a walk on the street. In the cold windy gray sand, all I saw were scenes of dying people and busy pedestrians coming and going. The weather is so nice, let's go for a walk. Are there mules in Beijing? Let's go and try riding them. Go ahead. Home is close. Why not go back when you can enjoy family happiness as a couple? Since the old man of the Chen family values him so much, he will certainly not refuse the loan raised by his father. So I think their family owes money to the Chen family. There must be quite a few. That day, the 5th day of the first lunar month, his father borrowed a donkey cart and donkey from the Chen family to take us into the city. On the way, because I had nothing to say, I said to him, Dash. It's a pity that Huiying of the Chen family didn't study. She is really smart. At first, when he heard what I said, his face suddenly turned red. Later, he felt that I didn't mean it maliciously when I said it, so he sighed and said, Dash. Alas. There are so many hateful things in the world. I looked at his demeanor. It seemed that he didn't want me to talk about these girls, so I kept silent. After arriving at school that day, the classmates had not returned yet, so he and I walked around the factory and listened to the opera. In other words, Mayamahuhu has just passed the winter vacation. After school started, it was a routine life again, with classes in and out of class, eating and sleeping, until summer vacation. During the summer vacation, because I missed home so much, I left him and went back to my home in the south for 2 months. When we got on the train, he walked me to the station, talked a lot of words of encouragement to each other, and asked me to write him a letter every day after I got home, reporting on the scenery in the south. As for my family, I said that I would like to work as a tutor for 2 months during the summer vacation so that I can make some pocket money. Buy some books. After I arrived in the south, although I didn't write letters every day, I still exchanged 5 or 6 letters with him in the middle of a month. From the information in the letter, I learned that he did not go home during the summer vacation, still lived in Beijing with a family named Huang to teach. You can also get a monthly salary of 20 yuan. At the end of August in the Gregorian calendar, he wrote a letter urging me to return to Beijing. He also said that he had returned to the Yinjiaji on the previous Saturday, and Huiying of the Chen family was still asking for news about me. Because he mentioned Huiying. I remembered what happened that day at the Yinjie gathering to celebrate the new year. Huiying is not beautiful, but her fair skin is rare among northern women. A pair of big eyes makes people fearful when they look at them. Because her eyes seem to see everything. She is neither short nor tall, and her round face makes people think she is a loyal person at first sight. But she is very capable, and since her stepmother died, all the family affairs have been in her hands. Her home. Sweep it very clean. A wing to the west was her sitting room, and all the account books and documents were placed in this wing. It was also in this room that Zhu Jun and I sat and talked in the days before and after the Chinese New Year. Her father likes to drink some wine. So during the first few days of the first month, he was always outside. When Zhu Jun and I went to her house, we would either tell jokes or tell stories with her younger brothers, or we would talk to her about trivial matters in Beijing schools. Zhu Jun was strict and silent towards her, just like he was towards our classmates. She didn't show any special affection towards Zhu Jun. Only one day, on the evening of the 4th day of the first lunar month, after dinner, Zhu Jun suddenly walked out of his home. I chatted with his father for a while, took some time, and walked out to go to Chen's house in front of him. I thought Zhu Jun must be sitting there with her. However, when she got to the wing, she talked with her little brothers for a few words and asked them, "Has Zhu Jun been here?" They all shook their heads and said, "No." Asked there, "Where's my sister?" They replied, "I'm sick and sleeping." When I returned to Zhu's house, just when I was about to go to bed on the Kong, Zhu Jun walked in quickly from the front door. Under the kerosene lamp, although I couldn't see his face clearly, I could tell from the tone of his voice when he spoke to me and his red and swollen eyes. It was as if he had just gone somewhere and had a good cry. After I received his letter urging me to return to Beijing, I thought of these details for a moment, and felt a little funny in my heart, so I said to myself, "Lao Zhu, you are probably in love too, right?" At the beginning of September in the Gregorian calendar, I arrived in Beijing. Zhu Jun had already returned to school. He had already arranged things such as bed, meals, etc. for me, so I could stay with him. The results of the summer exam have also been released. He was ranked 2nd, but I was ranked 5th, 3 places below him. So the study rooms are also combined. After school started, everything was the same as in previous years, and our lives went smoothly for more than a month. The weather in Beijing, the newly admitted students, the classmates in our first class, and everything else. Everything is the same as last semester, but Zhu Jun's character is a little different than before. He was usually silent, but after entering the 10th month of the solar calendar, he became even more silent. Originally, he was very economical with money. But after the new semester started, he always dragged me to the hotel to drink. After drinking a few drinks desperately, he loudly criticized the bad social system, the uneven economic distribution, the warlords, and the bureaucrats. Finally, he especially attacked the ignorance of the northern peasant class. Every detail is taken care of. I saw his sadness and indignation, and I was really moved by him, but in the end I had to persuade him with the cliché of obeying fate and obeying fate. He was originally diligent, but he worked even harder this semester. After the lights-out bell rang at night, he was still lighting candles alone in the study room, reading English books by Ellen K., Babel, Sudner, and others. I have also advised him several times, teaching him to recuperate in time and take care of his body. But he said to me proudly, "In a world like this, in a society like this, what's the use of living an ignoble existence? What does it mean to take care of yourself? You go to bed first." On Saturday afternoons and Sunday mornings, we originally agreed to go for a walk in the suburbs every week, but since he entered the 10th month of the Gregorian calendar, Don't excuse yourself and say it's because you haven't finished reading the book, just say it's because your health is not good and you always stay alone in the dormitory and don't go out. In fact, I see that his body is losing weight day by day. 2 thick eyebrows cast 2 layers of shadow, and his eye sockets were sunken deeply. He seems to be a little afraid of people, but he himself is still reading books that advocate social reform from morning to night. I watched him carefully and felt that his appetite was gradually decreasing. One day the wind blew very cold and the sky was covered with gray snow. On a morning when it seemed like it was going to snow heavily, the concierge suddenly came to our dormitory and said that there was a female guest who was looking for Mr. Zhu there. At that time, Zhu Jun had already gone out to the playground to take a walk and read a book. I walked to the playground, found him, and told him later. His face suddenly became devoid of any color, he glared twice, and asked me like an idiot, Is she here? Is she really here? I was shocked by him and said to him seriously. Whoever lies to you, just run out and take a look. He went out for half a day. When it was time for class, he didn't come into the classroom. At about 1 o'clock in the afternoon, I met him on the way to my self-study class in the next class. His face was grayer and gloomier than when I spoke to him in the morning, and his thick eyebrows were furrowed. The shadow widened, and his entire face was covered with a dead look. I met him and asked him who came in the morning, but he smiled slightly and said, It's Hu Ying. She came to Beijing to buy goods, and now she lives with her father in the Kaohsiung store of the polishing factory. Are you going to see her? Let's go together tonight. Go and listen to a play with them. After hearing what he said, I liked it very much, because the old man of the Chen family really wanted to listen to what he said. So I wanted to go to Kaohsiung's shop with him after dinner. Firstly, you can see Hu Ying, who has not been seen for more than half a year, and secondly, you can ask the old man of the Chen family to persuade Zhu Jun to use less energy. After dinner, the wind blew so hard that he and I had to take a foreign truck to the polishing factory. Go to Kaohsiung's store to have a look. The father and daughter were having dinner, and old man Chen was still drinking bygone. A mutton hot pot was burning on the table, filling the room with the aroma of the hot pot. The electric light was enveloped by the heat of the hot pot, illuminating the room dimly. Hu Ying wore a black cloth robe. When she stood up for us to sit down and drink, I felt that her appearance was much more beautiful than when she was at the Yin family gathering. Old man Chen insisted that we sit down and drink, so we had no choice but to sit down and have a few drinks. Drink and talk. I told him that Zhu Jun had been working too hard recently. After hearing what I said, old man Chen said to Zhu Jun, Yaru, your grades in college were not bad, so why do you do this again? I heard that you got second place in the exam, so that's good enough. Do you still want to win first place? In short, it's your body that matters. Your family is all looking forward to you earning money to support your family after graduating from college. If you are not in good health, it will be useless no matter how knowledgeable you are. Zhu Jun was speechless after hearing these words. Drinking cup after cup with head bent. I also had a headache due to drinking a little wine, so I couldn't see his expression. Looking back at Hu Ying, she seemed to have her head bowed and shed tears. That night, we talked for a long time. Finally, I didn't listen to the play. When we took the foreign car back to school, the hour for self-study had already passed. The next day, the Chen family's father and daughter had gone home, and we returned to our usual routine. Zhu Jun's hard work, silence, and complaining and depressed attitude. It is still the same as before, and it is not relieved by the advice of the old man of the Chen family. Time passes day by day, and winter is coming to an end again. The north wind continued to blow for a few days, and the coldness in the morning and evening suddenly increased. 1 week before the annual vacation exam. Everyone became nervous. Zhu Jun also stayed up for 3 nights in a row and reviewed his homework because he had read too many extracurricular books this semester and threw away his school textbooks. The morning before the exam, Zhu Jun suddenly got up early. He didn't even put on his socks and ran out in an unkempt state. When he ran to the concierge, he grabbed the concierge and asked him to hand over the man. The concierge was confused and asked him who the person he was talking about was, but he just stopped the concierge and started making noise. But he refused to name that person. The noise got louder, so we all went out to take a look. When we saw that it was Zhu Jun making a noise with the concierge, I stepped in. At this time, when I saw Zhu Jun's expression, I was also shocked. His eyes were red with blood. The 2 eyebrows stood straight up, his face was a dull blue-gray color, and his forehead and neck were covered with many blue veins. As soon as he saw us, he showed 2 rows of snow-white teeth, smiled as if weeping together and said, Okay, you are all here. You keep this little warlord under guard and let me take out my pistol and shoot him. As he said that, he pushed the concierge on top of me and 2 other classmates. We were not on guard against him, and the 4 of us fell to the ground together after he pushed us like this. But he laughed a few times and ran straight in. After seeing his behavior, we all knew that he was insane, so we discussed asking the school guards to keep him in the infirmary while we notified the school authorities. Please ask the school to ask a doctor to treat him quickly. Sitting alone in the infirmary, he became impatient and insisted on coming out to fight with the school janitor. He also referred to the school guard who was guarding him as a petty warlord and cursed. "You bastard, a little warlord like you. Do you dare to forcefully marry someone else's daughter? Come on, bring the pistol, come on, bring the pistol." The school doctor came to see his illness and was beaten several times by him. He also tore off a pair of the school doctor's glasses and broke them. I stood at the door and cried several times with tears in my eyes, Zhu Jun. Zhu Jun. Can't you even recognize me? With his eyes bare, he looked at me for a moment, and then he laughed and said, "You little bastard, are you here to swindle money?" As he said that, he hit me again, and we had no choice but to lock the door of the infirmary. On the one hand, he sent people to his home to report the news and asked his parents to come out to take care of his illness. Towards evening, his father came, and with him was the old man of the Chen family. I went out with them that night and rented a room in an apartment. Zhu Jun's illness became more and more severe. The three of us finally stayed up all night because we wanted to stop his violence. The next morning, I went back to school early to take the exam, and in the afternoon, I went to the apartment to see him. Knowing that they had rented another small house, Zhu Jun was tied up. I took the exam in school for 3 days. On the day I finished the exam, I received an urgent letter early in the morning, saying that Zhu Jun was no longer alive and wanted me to go there and see him. When I got there, I took a look and saw that he was tied to a plank bed like a ghost in a small room in Heichichi. The air in the room was extremely foul and smelly, and in the black and smelly air, only the sounds of slight breathing and diarrhea could be heard. I stood silently at the door for a while. I couldn't bear it anymore, so I raised my voice and shouted, "Zhu Jun," and "Zhu Jun" twice. His old father, who was sitting behind his feet, immediately raised his hand to stop me from speaking. When Zhu Jun heard my call, he turned his head to look at me. I only saw a black skull-like head and 2 very black eyes. I stepped into the small room and took a look at him. I saw that his hands and feet were still tied, but his head was leaning softly on the pillow, sitting behind his father's feet. There was also Zhu Jun's daughter-in-law, her eyes red and swollen from crying, her head shrunk blankly, guarding her dying man. I looked forward and back, and tears suddenly welled up in my eyes. I walked up to his pillow, leaned down, and asked him softly, "Zhu Jun, do you still recognize me?" He couldn't continue talking. He turned his head and looked at me again. His face had no expression at all, but looking through my teary eyes, it seemed that tears were flowing out of the corners of his eyes. I approached his father. Asked where old man Shen had gone. His father said, "Hu Ying is going to marry an officer today, so he has already gone back to arrange the wedding." I asked Zhu Jun again what kind of medicine he was taking, and his father just shook his head and said, "I don't know either. But after he took the medicine. But it has continued till now, and now it seems that it is no longer possible." I thought to myself, this must be the wrong medicine. Otherwise, why would he become like this within 3 days? When I was about to speak, I heard another sound of diarrhea. Zhu Jun's head shook a few times on the pillow, and there was a gurgling sound in his throat. My hair stood up in fear. At the same time, his father and his wife also stood up and rushed to his pillow. I saw his head twitch upward a few times, and his throat made a few noises. After twitching slightly for a quarter of an hour, all movement stopped. His daughter-in-law burst into tears, and his father was so anxious that he just stood there silently. But I couldn't bear it any longer, so I lowered my head and whispered in his ear, "Zhu Jun. Zhu Jun." He screamed 2 or 3 times. The next morning, it started to snow again. Zhu Jun's father, his wife, and I took Zhu Jun's coffin out of the city in a big car early in the morning. At this time, residents inside and outside the city had not yet gotten up, and the long street was very cold. A large car, carrying Zhu Jun's spiritual hub in the front, and the 3 of us sitting in the back, slowly turned away in the snow. Snowflakes accumulated on the red felt covering the coffin in front, but Zhu Jun's father and I were wrapped in a tattered quilt to avoid the north wind blowing from behind. There are very few pedestrians on the street. The sound of Zhu Jun's daughter-in-law crying was even more sad. When the cart walked out of Yongding Gate, the yellow-gray sun came out, and the snowflakes seemed to be less. I remembered the time I went to Zhu Jun's house with him during last winter vacation. Unknowingly, he called Ling Shu in front twice, and suddenly he couldn't help but burst into tears. July 16, 1927. Originally published in Education Magazine, Volume 19, Number 7, July 20, 1927. Education, Literature and Art column, published with the title, Examination. Nostalgia Sick. 1. When the sun comes into contact with the night shadow, in the middle of the vast wilderness, I turn my head towards the chaotic and broad sky. Step by step he walked away without knowing what his own home was. He didn't know what he should do or where he was going. He just felt that his feet had to be released step by step. This was Yu Shifu's current mental state. In a half-awake consciousness. He only vaguely knew that the world would become dark from now on, that the dry land in the wilderness would gradually turn into a swamp with water, and that his feet would not be able to move freely moment by moment. But he had no intention of changing direction. He still turned his head toward the dark sky and walked step by step. At 3 o'clock before noon on the 20th day of the 9th month of the lunar calendar, when the east was not yet white, the hostage's body was trembling while he was in the shadow of a dark gray lamp. He got up from the bed and put on his old cotton robe. There were a few rustling sounds of falling leaves coming from the yard, probably because a crabapple tree had withered there. In the kitchen behind his dormitory was a bannerman's cook and the cook's nephew. It was the coachman of his brother's family, talking there once or twice. In the silence of the night, he felt that their words were loud, but he could not hear anything. The hostage went out to the yard to take a look and felt that the moon was shining brightly in the remaining night in the old northern capital. It also carries some mournful tune of national subjugation. Because of the waning half-moon hanging in the dark sky, the light seemed to be frozen in the sky. He ate a bowl of fried rice, took a pen and ink, opened the door gently, got into his brother's car and walked out of the alley. It felt like he was the only one still awake and floating in the middle of the crowd in the royal city at this moment. After walking through several streets and alleys under the cold gray streetlights, and walking onto the Yuchao Bridge, there were suddenly a few mournful trumpet sounds, like the cries of a child waking up from a dream. Came to his two cold ears. He turned his head to look at the same ice-like moon in the southwest corner, then raised his head to look at the lights in the city wall that sounded the trumpet, and felt that the miserable feelings were like ice water poured over it. His whole body. Outside the door is the main road to the botanical garden. Follow this road and go down the slope. Turn to the right and you will find the main entrance of the botanical garden. He walked to the main entrance of the botanical garden and met many young men and women, wearing colorful clothes and dragging their soft, white and fat feet. It seemed that he was tired of traveling and wanted to walk home while it was still dark. I don't know whether the appearance of these young men and women is beautiful or ugly. If he had met them 6 months ago, he would have looked carefully, but today he was unwilling to raise his head. He only remembered a 17 or 18-year-old female student on the road, who seemed to say to her companion. There were 2 blushes on the young man's cheeks, and his breath was slightly tipsy, as if he had gotten drunk somewhere. Girl's cheek. Although there was a bit of pink blood, because of her charming long eyebrows and the high bridge of her nose, she finally felt that there was a cold shadow cast on her marble-like face. The 2 of them were silent for a while, like Pisces in the water, slowly swimming in the clear moonlight. This is the dream life of a young hostage boy, and it already happened 10 years ago. She later married one of his classmates. When the hostage returned to China 4 years ago, he only saw her once on a quiet autumn afternoon in the market of his hometown, and only saw her pregnant side. 3. This was the scene a few years ago when my hostage was taking the exam for international students in Beijing. After the first exam, a strange thing was suddenly reported in the news. Why do international students need to take the exam? The people who should take the exam this time were already designated by the ministry before taking the exam. I pity those who came to take the exam from other provinces. People are still dreaming of becoming a foreign Hanlin and a foreign bachelor. This is another tragic and comic memory of a scene a few years ago. 4. After walking around for a while, the hostage felt a little tired. The night view of this island nation's capital seems a bit depressing. Raise your head and look at the street lights on both sides. They were all places where he couldn't rest, so he had no choice but to find the nearest way back to his apartment. When he reached the entrance of the botanical garden, a signboard written in red and green suddenly shone into his eyes from an electric light of 100 candles. Dragging his tired feet, he slowly walked up the stairs of this Chinese pub. There was no customer upstairs. After ordering a plate of food and a bottle of wine, he put his head on his hands and slept on the table for a few minutes. After the food and wine were brought, he raised his head and took a look. Only then did he realize that the person standing in front of him was a 16 or 17-year-old Chinese girl. He has a round face and pretty features. He asked her where she was from, and she said. The hostage knew that if he could refresh himself and let out a cry for help, or he could escape from this current situation, but he had neither the perseverance nor the desire. The hostage was upstairs. He confusedly concluded that the wall clock next door had indeed struck 5 o'clock, and then slowly walked downstairs. Because dinner is scheduled to be served at 5 o'clock in his apartment. If we go one step further and talk about a now popular saying, his current mental state is the same as Oblomov's state of numbness. Let's take a closer look at an analogy. His state is that of a small lonely boat floating on a river that seems to be still. There was no helmsman or sail on the solitary boat. It just floated slowly along with the current under the water of the river. There was half a bowl of rice in Honghua's small bowl. He felt as if he couldn't finish it, but he ate it in one breath. After finishing half the bowl of rice, he didn't want to add more, so he went upstairs to get a yellow and black soft hat and walked out. She smiled and nodded to her hostage, who then gave her the wine glass in his hand. The hostess poured her glasses of wine 1 cup at a time. She suddenly threw the cup on the table and jumped into his arms. She hugged the hostage's neck tightly with both hands, and bit his face with her small mouth. As she said this, she untied her upper and lower clothes. The hostage stared blankly for several minutes. Suddenly she felt a line of cold tears flowing down between his right cheek and her left cheek. Only then did he realize that she was drunk. He silently buttoned her clothes up and down, placed her on the chair where he sat, and then walked downstairs to pay the bill. When he walked out of the restaurant, he suddenly thought, While pouring wine for her hostage, she seemed to be talking. The hostage seemed to be answering her with his mouth, but he didn't feel it at all in his heart. When she finished speaking and stopped talking, the hostage was shocked by the wordless silence, so he asked her casually. In such a depressed state, Yu Zhifu looked out the window, watching the white clouds coming and going in the blue sky of late spring, and listening to the small pieces of cherry blossoms and the soft sound of falling trees in the calm wind. He felt that a layer of gauze was forming in front of his eyes, and 2 drops of water suddenly accumulated on his knees. He stood up and wanted to reach out to take out a book from the bookshelf to read, but stopped again. As if in a dream, I sat there in a daze for I don't know how long. But he heard the wall clock next door ringing 5 times. When he raised his head and took a look, he realized that he was still sitting blankly on the small building where he lived. On a clear and early summer evening, the small county town on the Qiantang River. Just like the castles of various feudal lords in the European Middle Ages, they are silvery white and lie in the shadow of the frost-like moonlight. The bright moon surged halfway up, and thousands of silver waves floated, silently, flowing eastward among the mountains on both sides of the bank, which were alternately dark and light. It was a place where Emin of the Eastern Han dynasty went fishing. Covered with a layer of mist, half swallowing and half vomiting, it looks like a palace guest trying to take a bath in the Huaqing pool. Floating in the middle of the misty moon is the pavilion where the survivors of the Song dynasty cried bitterly. In the northwest district of this small county surrounded by these relics of the previous dynasty, a young man and woman of 14 or 15 years old walked slowly along the stone embankment on the city river under the shade of willows. It was almost the second watch, and everyone in the city was already asleep, leaving only a dark ancient city. Silently, it seemed as if I was listening to their infatuated conversation under the moonlight. Wait a minute, did the wall clock really ring 5 times? Or maybe it was, because the sun was already sinking beneath the branches of the botanical gardens to the west. 2. He entered the Donghua gate with a group of gentlemen who were shaking their heads and tailing. While waiting for roll call in the stone Mingtang outside the Hall of Supreme Harmony, the hostage raised his head again and glanced at the blue sky that was about to dawn. For some reason, he felt like he looked like he had suffered countless grievances. Shaking his head, sighing, and suddenly having a few cold convulsions, the hostage wanted to throw away the pen and ink he was holding and run away to a foreign country to study and make bombs. This girl doesn't know what's going on. I really don't like him. E is very hot, very hot. E wanted to go back to her house. E is Shanghai. Do you drink? After walking a few steps in the heavy night air, he forgot about her. He also forgot about the restaurant. He also forgot about today's walk. He even forgot about his own body. He just walked forward slowly in the darkness. The concepts of time and space, and everything in the world, completely disappeared in his mind. Painted in a restaurant in Tokyo at 5 o'clock in the afternoon on April 2, 1922. Originally published in Creation Monthly, Volume 1, Issue 2, April 16, 1926. Green smoke. As I sit idle in the quiet summer night air, I don't know how many sad thoughts are surging in my mind. Looking at the electric light shining through the blue gauze that looks like green water, and listening to the tired sound of cars coming from Jing'an Temple Road outside the window, I feel like my family has returned to the days of youth depression. My tears, which are worth less than women, are reflected on my cheeks again. When I look up, I can see the calendar that urges people to grow old. Time passes day by day, but my career, my situation, my future, have gone through a lot of hardships. I thought I had something in my grasp, but when I let go of my tightly clenched fist, I saw that there was only a puff of smoke in my hand. After hearing this question, the woman stopped and answered him. Another car horn sounded in the distance. This is probably the triumphant song of Western capitalist men and women returning home from a lascivious nude dance hall. You have to be young, have a beautiful face, and be rich. Although the Dragon Boat Festival has just passed, I can't sleep in such a hot late night. I'd better turn off the light and look at the scenery outside the window. The second person said. The third and fourth people all laughed. After this group of people passed by, the riverside returned to the state of silence it had been a moment ago. The space outside the window only contains intricate roof ridges and spires, which are illuminated by the distant light of a few gas lamps, resembling movie balconies, and their outlines are drawn in the faint night air. Everything was quiet, but I heard the breeze blowing the window leaves. It seems like nature is sighing quietly there. The sound of cars outside the window gradually became less and less. In the vast world, I could only hear the sound of my pen writing on the paper. Put your head out the window and take a look. I only saw a dark curve of summer night sky, with a few remaining stars faintly reflected. I put down my pen and walked a few steps in my matchbox-like room. I felt a sense of desolation and loneliness permeate my whole body. I don't know where this melancholy comes from. Except for a few lazy barkings of dogs, there was no movement of any living thing on the river bank. On the opposite bank of the river, there were several families in several woods, lying quietly in the frost-like moonlight. There is a touch of green hills outside the woods, floating there like a dream like smoke. At this time, everyone on the riverside at the south gate of F City was already asleep. The houses along the river are all covered with the waning moon, reflecting in the flowing river waves. Although it is the night of the first summer, it is late at night. There is also a slight chill on the river. A few friends who know my character well said. A few journalists who were parasitic under the wings of wealthy people said. A few people who worked as slaves for journalists like the ones before said. The moon is going to set. My brother said. Whenever I hear this sentence, even if I am hugging a fat naked woman and drinking heavily, I will burst into tears, but if you ask again, you're melancholy? Is the root cause here? I will definitely open my tearful eyes, shake my head at you and say, no, no. What does it matter if the country dies? Didn't Sienkiewicz, the poet of the subjugated country, make a grand career for the rest of his life? Aren't all my compatriots living in the concession very comfortable? What will happen if the country dies? Wouldn't it be better for foreigners to manage us? Lu Jianan's two good poems, Wang Shibei sets the day for the Central Plains, and he never forgets to tell Nai Wang about family sacrifices. Wasn't it possible to do it because the country was destroyed? Now that my young blood has dried up, I still don't have the same patriotic enthusiasm as before. I am no longer a chauvinist. I just want it to be true as they say. If my depression is fake, then even if they scold me even more harshly, or even give them a few old books I own and a few dollars of daily bread money I don't know where to buy, I will still be willing to do so. I just want what I say to be complaints. Well, I can even give them the felucca I am planning to light on fire, because people who complain are always a little conceited, but now I feel that my body and mind are as exhausted as the shadow of the wind. What else can you be proud of? I returned to my seat from the window, turned on the light, and looked in the mirror for a few minutes. I felt that this thin appearance was not carnivorous after all. In such a helpless time, I still smoke. In order to unify my thoughts, I struck a match and lit a felucca. After taking a deep breath, I exhaled the cigarette completely onto the green gauze cover of the electric lamp. Surrounded by green veil. Just like after a rain in the deep mountains in summer, a layer of lavender clouds appeared. Staring blankly at this layer of clouds, my body seemed to shrink and sit in the middle of this lavender cloud. This layer of light clouds and mist drifted away. My body then split into two, a shrunken body floating in the mist, and the original body still sitting under the green light of the electric light, watching me from afar in the green smoke. It was already dusk. The sky is surrounded by the afterglow of the setting sun. There is a circle of silver-red ribbons on the four sides, and Xiang Tianxin gradually turns into a bright blue color. The 8-point full moon hangs leisurely and faintly in the eastern half of the sky. A few minutes passed, and the originally pale moon began to shine. A meandering river flows under the moonlight. There are lush woods and empty sandy beaches on both sides of the river. Sandwiched in the middle of the woods and sand, each one is a mile or two away, and there are several densely populated villages. The village is surrounded by a group of cascading green hills. Where the river bends, the hills also fold into bow shapes. Between the bowstrings of white water and the bowbacks of green mountains, hundreds of families live together, which is where the county seat of F County is located. The moonlight, which is similar to transparent water, spreads evenly over the county, rivers, green mountains, woods, and villages 1 or 2 miles away from the county. Dusk shadows. It can be seen everywhere. F County, which is usually very quiet, is full of life tonight. The lights in every house are brighter than usual, and the people walking on the street are noisier than usual. The moon tonight. It almost makes me feel shy compared to the small artificial one. This day is the 10th day of the 5th lunar month in the lunar calendar, and it is the day of the annual acting marshal meeting in F County. Although he couldn't tell what kind of clothes she was wearing under the moonlight, the expression on her face was very haggard. Her words were very sad, and his questions became softer and trembling. After a pause, a group of people returning from the theater broke the silence and walked across the river at the south gate. A man said towards the river. But if I had such a myriad mind, would have become Shakespeare long ago. His last sentence was very quiet, and before he finished speaking, he ran away. The woman stared at his back in the moonlight for a while, and saw his shadow getting smaller step by step. At the same time, she heard his secret cry from a distance, and 2 lines of tears rolled down her face. Come out. He slowly walked to the center of Nanjing Street, stopped, looked left and right, and walked in from an alley that was gray and white under the moonlight. Although the street is lively, this narrow alley is still deserted. Turned a corner to the south. Arriving in front of a large gate, he hesitated for a while and then walked over. After walking 2 or 3 steps, he turned around again. Peeking in the door, he saw a foreign lamp burning on the table in the middle of the main hall. A bright fluorescent light shines on the upper wall. A picture of Zhong Kuei and several pairs of characters on wax paper came out. The rest of the hall was empty and there was no one around. He walked back and forth at the door several times, with 2 crystal black lights emitting from his eyes, as if he was about to cry. Finally, when he walked around and passed the door of the wall, a woman about his age walked out. Because she walked between him and the lantern, he only saw her fluffy hair reflected in the light of the lantern. He hurriedly walked 3 or 5 steps. Just stopped. The woman walked out of the wall door and walked in the opposite direction to him. He walked around again and caught up with the woman. The woman suddenly turned her head when she heard his footsteps. When he looked at her in the gray moonlight, he was stunned as if he had been electrocuted. The woman turned around and glanced at him slightly, then walked forward again. He caught up and asked the woman softly. What the world calls success is like a cloud to me. I occasionally wrote a few conceptual novels when I was bored. Although I was attacked by others, I didn't feel sad at all. The material difficulties only taught me to grit my teeth and be patient, and it didn't matter. But since I was born. In the past 20 years or so, among the seeds and flowers I have planted at home, how can any of the flowers be bright? Where has any branch ever bore fruit? Ah, if a person's life can be erased and changed, my second life will be. I never want it to be the same as my life in the past 20 years. I learned to be a carpenter when I was a child, and by now I have built at least 1 or 2 houses. When I'm bored, I go to the house I built with my own hands to see how lonely I am. It can definitely be mitigated. If I had learned to be a tailor since I was a child, it goes without saying that I would be able to cut up light embroidered satin and sew it into fine shirts. When I am bored, if I open up the delicate blouses and dresses that I cut and sew at home, my depression will definitely be relieved. But I have no talent for any art. I used to lie to myself and comfort myself by taking out the masterpieces of ancient and modern Chinese and foreign literati. Now after waking up from the dream, I feel ashamed after reading the works of these famous artists, so now I can't even drink poison. It can't quench my thirst. What else can I do to fill the emptiness in my chest? A thin man, about 40 years old, slowly dragged his tired feet into the east gate of F County at dusk, walking in the shadow of his own house. Step by step, he walked westward among the pedestrians on the long street. His green and yellow face showed a look of fear, and there were already a few wrinkles on his forehead and under his eyes. A short, tangled beard grew randomly around his mouth. And the dirty, old bamboo cloth shirt he was wearing proved that he was a down-and-out person. His back was bent forward, and his eyes, like dead fish, were peeking ahead and to the left and right. He seemed to be afraid of people knowing him. It seems like someone is looking for a confidant there. He set out from the provincial capital of H this morning and walked 90 miles until he reached his hometown of F, which he had not seen for 20 years. Then where did the U family move to? So are you the only one living here in the U family? Don't come looking for me, you drowned man. I still have a wife and son to raise at home. My man has been away for more than 20 years and I don't know where he is, so I can't go to Beijing or Tianjin. Now I am helping the Liu family cook here. Is my sister-in-law's family named you? My mother-in-law passed away last year. It's so cold and frightening that my hair is standing on end. I don't want a drowned ghost looking for a substitute here. The eldest uncle is in Beijing, and the second uncle is in Tianjin. Oh. Thank you. Oh. AI. I live in the 3rd room. AI. It used to be named you, but now it is sold to the Liu family. Oh, poor you are born at this time, when China is making such troubles. No wonder you are just depressed every day. You can't do it well when you run north, and you can't do it well when you run south. Your melancholy is justifiable, whether you were born 10 years earlier or 10 years later. Why are you asking the Yu family? Are you the Yu family's sister-in-law? Your melancholy is all artificial, all pointless moaning, and ugly. What you feel is Tosca. This is what everyone in China feels now. You are complaining because no one is using you. Where is their old lady? A phantom. The moon has set, and the night air on the riverside suddenly turned gray. The stars in the sky shine one by one, reflecting in Jiangxian. At this time, another slender figure flashed out from the riverside at the south gate, slowly lingering on the water's edge, only a foot or 2 away from the water. Because this figure moves very slowly, it appears. It cannot destroy the quiet air on the riverside. But a few minutes later, the figure suddenly jumped into the middle of the river. Jiangbo was excited, and the silence on the riverside was broken. The stars on the river shook a bit, as if they were falling from the sky. The river waves widened in circles, and the starlight reflected in the river waves also swayed a few times. The sound of a person entering the water, the reverberation of the quiet night on the river, and the time when the circle of the river waves disappears. The gray river is still dominated by the silence of death, and the dawn is still far away. Epilogue. I stared blankly at the green light of the electric light, smoking almost all the pack of cigarettes I just bought tonight. The distant crowing of cocks and the whistle coming from nowhere reached my eardrums intermittently, and my mind was reminded of the dawn. Isn't it? Look. Can't you clearly see the roof tiles outside the window line by line? Ah. This bright blue sky. It's dawn time. Ah, but I heard a lot of toilet cleaning sounds under the window. This is a symbol. Our so-called dawners in China are the beginning of a dirty hand gesture drama. 4 o'clock before noon on May 10th of the lunar calendar in 1923. Originally published in Creation Weekly No. 8, June 30th, 1923. Before the separation. 1. The melancholy autumn rain outside is getting heavier and heavier. The dripping sound from the eaves is like the tears of a mourner. All in a click. Although the clock on the wall had struck 9 times a moment ago, the air in the room on the first floor and the bottom was still as dark and stuffy as dawn. From time to time, a cool breeze blew, a sycamore tree outside the window behind was swayed by the wind. There was a pattering sound of water drops accumulating on the branches. The front room downstairs, which was originally small, felt even more cramped because of a few wooden boxes piled randomly in the middle. There are also many books arranged vertically and horizontally on a round table in the middle. Broken newsprint and the like are there waiting for the owner to sort them out. Ding-ling-ling, the doorbell rang behind, and a very thin young man in his 20s or 70s came into the front room where luggage was piled up. Following him was a maid, in her 30s. While pouring tea, he said to him. The wind picked up, and a burst of rain drifted across the gray glass window. The hostage glanced at the window, sighed, and continued his meditation. There was a sound on the middle escalator. 2 children in Japanese clothes ran down. Before they even got off the escalator, they shouted loudly in Japanese. The young man gave her a sad smile, nodded, took off a raincoat, hung it on the wall, and took it from the pile of wooden boxes. I took out a foldable chair and sat down. After his aunt returned to the kitchen at the back, he looked blankly at the wooden boxes of books, and his eyes suddenly turned red. There was a slight click, and a blue vein appeared on his forehead. 2 blushes appeared on her cheeks. He took out a white handkerchief from his bag and wiped it on his mouth. He sat in silence for another 3 to 5 minutes. Finally, when he took out a cigarette to smoke, he faced the second floor and shouted twice, While the hostage and Hiru's wife were talking in Japanese, Hiru hugged the child and stared at the rain outside. The hostage said to Mrs. Kwong again. The lady looked at the rain outside and said in a long voice. He coughed a few more times. On the morning of the next day, the autumn rain cleared up, and the sky after the rain became even bluer and lovely. The dirt and sand on the repaired road were washed away by the night rain. Although there was a cool breeze blowing in the sky, it did not fly on the ground. The dust and sand are rising. It was about 10 o'clock in the morning. Yujifu wore a long linen gown and walked on the road to Kwang Hiru's place to eat. Because the inn where he lived usually didn't cook, so when everyone was hungry, they would get some wheat to eat. Yujifu has been pampered since he was a child. I can't eat any wheat food. Most of his illness was caused by the endless meals, so he would rather travel several miles. He had no money to take the tram, to go to Kwang Hiru's place to eat. Moreover, Kwang and Zheng will be leaving in a few days, so the 3 of them will gather together. There may not be another chance in the future, so Yujifu wants to never leave them. However, Zheng, Kwang, and you all decided to leave Shanghai together for the sake of their own lives. The departure date was already set. So Hua's Jing lived on them and was homeless. Before they set off, they had to find a house elsewhere to recover. 3. When Hiru said this, his wife, who was brought from Japan, held a child under 1-year-old in her arms. I also walked downstairs and joined their conversation group. When she saw the 2 older children crowding around the hostage, she yelled at the older one, "Baby, why don't you go away?" Hiru wore a black overalls and slowly followed his 2 children. The 2 children approached where the young man named Yu was sitting, and each jumped on his lap to sit. The younger brother said to the young man named Yu in incomplete Japanese. Hiru asked him again. The hostage shook his head and replied. Hiru also took out a chair from the pile of wooden boxes. After sitting down, he asked the man named Yu. Just when they were forced to have no choice but to rush back to their hometown, one of their descendants, Hua Sijing, came. Sijing's family was impoverished. This time, he came back from Tokyo to spend his summer vacation. When he left for Japan after his summer vacation half a month ago, he sold all his family property and only had 60 yuan to pay for his trip eastward. An old widowed mother who could not be sold, he sent her to a relative's home. Poor people are unlucky. When Si Jing went to Shanghai, he was Yujifu's hometown, he caught a cold and became a lung disease. His 60 yuan travel expenses were all used up in a few days. Zheng, Kwang, and you felt sympathy for him, and 5 days ago, because he spent a lot of money in the hospital, he was invited to live in the room on the first floor and the first floor. Zheng, Kwang, and you were all classmates when they studied in Japan. Although the characteristics and family backgrounds of the 3 people are different, they love righteousness more than wealth. The nature of being enamored with literature and art is the same for both of them, because they have received a little deeper education than others, so they have no understanding of the world and the ways of the world. They all hated their contemporaries who had used hypocritical and despicable means to gain an upper hand in society. Therefore, their remarks have to be attacked at every turn. In the past 1 or 2 years, they have tried their best and shouted loudly to save the situation from the worst. However, the snobbery in society is really like the wind in the grass, the result of their desperate struggle. Not worth a punch from a rich and powerful person. The publishers of their magazines and works initially invited them because they had some merits, but when they saw that their way out was blocked and had no other options, they became harsh on them. At first, they were provided with pocket money and food, clothing, and shelter. Later, they used the method of removing fuel from the bottom of the cauldron and gave away their pocket money and food and clothing. Now even the place to live has become a problem. It turns out that the hometown of this publisher was devastated by severe drought and floods for 2 years. So a large number of his fellow villagers came to make a living from him. He had always regarded himself as Lord Mengchang, so he naturally wanted Zheng, Kuang, and Yu to be among the diners, as well as many farm workers and petty officials from his hometown, and treat them equally. However, the income from a book publishing industry is limited after all, and the number of investors from the villagers in the lean years is endless. Therefore, the supply of Zheng, Kuang, and Yu had to be reduced day by day. The three of them suffered from austerity in food, clothing, and housing. His body gradually became weak. Now that they have no choice but to go to their respective hometowns. Once it was Hunan, Kuang was Sichuan, then Zhejiang. Zheng, Kuang, Yu and Hua, as well as Kuang's wife and children, were in that room after lunch. The rain still keeps falling. Because it was getting colder, Yu Zhifu didn't have a coat or clothes on him, so he walked out of the room on the first floor and the bottom, braved the rain and went back to the publisher's warehouse where he lived, trying to sleep under the quilt. Go get some heat. The inn, like a refuge for refugees, had recently been filled with the publisher's fellow countrymen. Because Yu Zhifu was afraid of meeting and talking to so many people, as soon as he arrived at the inn, he walked upstairs from the pile of books, took off his raincoat, and fell asleep under the quilt. He went to bed just to get warm under the quilt, so even though he lay under the quilt, he couldn't fall asleep. Looking at the roof and listening to the autumn rain outside the window, his heart felt sour. His thoughts were flying back and forth in the air. After handing the child in her arms to Hairu, she said to her husband. The doorbell at the back door rang again, and everyone's eyes turned to Huku, who came from the back and walked into the front room where they were sitting. Walking in were a swarthy gentleman in a western suit and a short-sighted young man in trousers and a slightly stooped back. The latter's complexion was thin and sallow, and he could be easily identified as a patient at a glance. Seeing the two of them coming in, Hairu asked. It turns out that the person wearing the foreign suit is Xing Jisheng, and the person wearing Lubaksugo is Hua Xijing. Hua Xijing left home and wanted to go to Japan, but he contracted an illness in Shanghai and spent all his travel expenses, so he stayed in a house with one floor that belonged to Xing Jisheng and Kuang Hairu. Now, Kuang and his wife were oppressed and had to leave, so Hua Xijing, who was living there, had to find another house to move. Although Yu Zhifu lived in another place, his residence was even more pitiful than that of Zheng and Kuang, and he was in the same situation as Zheng and Kuang. This time he was forced to go home to recuperate despite being seriously ill. In fact, he, Zheng and Kuang both felt indescribable grief and indignation. 2. He coughed for a while and emptied his mind. After a few seconds, he heard several people downstairs saying, dash. He heard this sentence. One man's face turned red. Several relatives of publishers who were talking downstairs seemed to think that he had not returned yet, so they confided in him. Unexpectedly, he happened to hear these whispers. He wanted to deceive others. Wanting to avoid this blatant insult, I had to pretend that I wasn't upstairs. Unfortunately, his throat was very itchy, but he had to hold back from coughing. After enduring it for a few minutes, he suppressed every cough. However, the last cough could not be suppressed no matter what. Instead, it was like a water embankment bursting. His cough, which had been suppressed many times, suddenly came out. After he coughed heavily, his face turned red and his body felt tired. He lay there for a moment with his eyes open. He fell into a deep sleep. Ah! How happy it would be if he never woke up again after falling asleep this time. 4. They all replied at the same time. Yu Zhifu held 2 children in his arms and raised his head and replied, dash. After the departure date has been decided. On the contrary, I want everyone to stay together for a few more days. Hostage, are you going to Beijing or going back to Zhejiang? Dad and mother are going back to a place far, far away. Hairu. Kuang. No, where did he say he went? The one upstairs is located by Mr. Why aren't you leaving yet? With him gone, we will have more space. Ani, I have decided to go back to Zhejiang. Si Jing went out with Ji Sheng. If Ji Sheng hadn't come to your place, he would probably have gone looking for a house for Si Jing. Where have my fellow sufferers gone? My child raised in my hometown. It's time for you to grow older. My woman who lives in my in-laws' family, don't you hate me? I really don't want to go back to my hometown. But being mistreated and starving to death in Shanghai is not worth it. Found it. Did Ji Sheng go to your place? This rain is really annoying. When we set off, it's better to have a clear sky. You are no match for me, this road is very long. Poor Hairu, how do you support your son and wife? Poor Ji Sheng and Si Jing. You don't even have children or wives. I am the poor one who has both of you, but I am still myself. The whole family is in the autumn wind, and the clothes are not cut in September. The vast future is like a sea of sorrow, and the words are expressed and the whip is whipped quickly. Ah, Huang Zhongzi also had Bai Chifan at that time. Now not even half of Bai Chifan is gone. Today's love is not the same as it used to be. Don't throw away your efforts as a lyricist. I'll go teach. However, when teaching, you have to be despicable and dirty to form a party. I'll go pull the car. Ah, these hands. How can these hands, with only a layer of skin and bones left, be able to pull? Isn't it? From now on, we will always be separated more and less. Once you arrive in Sichuan, you probably won't come out again. My illness, after winter. I don't know what kind of changes are going to happen. Beijing is in such a bad state that there is no other way to go, so I decided to go back to Zhejiang. There are only a few days left. Have you decided? You're okay. Hua Jun's illness is more severe than yours. Xing Jun went to look for a house for him, but he didn't know if he could find it or not. Have you found the house? When he went out, I asked him to find you who came here to have lunch with you. They are packing their luggage upstairs. Uncle Yu. Uncle Yu. Yu Zhifu slowly walked to the place where Kuang and Zheng lived near Jing'an Temple, and saw a rickshaw parked at the back door. The hostage drove through the back door and walked into the hall, only to see Kuang, Zheng, and Mrs. Kuang standing there blankly. The two children stood beside their mother silently. The hostage broke into this silent scene to greet them, and was silently stunned. After a few minutes, Haas came downstairs carrying a rattan basket. He walked to the place where the four people were standing, placed the rattan basket, and said to Kuang, Zheng, and the other three in a dejected tone, I'm sorry for bothering you for so many days. I'll see you off when you get on the ship. We'll have to talk a few more times before we disperse. As he spoke, he took a closer look at his short-sighted eyes, turned back to the hostage and said, You haven't left yet. The hostage replied vaguely. I can leave at any time. After everyone has left, why am I still living in Shanghai alone? I'll go back after I send them to the boat. The hostage pointed at Kuang and Zheng with his face. Hua Xijing said, disrespect, bowed his head and slowly walked onto the rickshaw by the back door. Mrs. Kuang shed tears because, so don't send it out. The other three people and the child all sent his car out of the road and did not return until they were out of sight. After returning, the four of them sat in silence for a while, and Hai Rutsai quietly said to her husband. One is gone. Ah. Wait until we get on the boat. You are left to take the train home from Shanghai. Aren't you afraid of being lonely? You'd better go first, we have more people so we can get you on the bus. The hostage replied very gloomily, it doesn't matter who goes first and who sees off whom. It's just our struggle in the past 2 years. But it will be equal to 0. Ah. Thinking about it, it really feels like I'm dreaming here. What a huge difference between when we first published a quarterly magazine and now. Go get the manuscript for this quarterly magazine before they have copied it. Kuang Hairu replied quietly. I was also thinking about this, how could I publish an announcement in the weekly newspaper? If you want to post any notices, just stop. The hostage said angrily. Hairu continued, if we don't publish the notice, we are afraid that people will not know our suffering and say that we have a beginning but no end. The hostess simply gave up on himself and said. What's the use of people knowing our suffering? Are we still trying to revive the quarterly magazine? Only Xing Jisheng listened to these words, but remained silent and just touched the scrofula on his face. After lunch, they each talked a lot of empty words, until everyone finally burst into tears. That night, the hostage did not return to sleep in the prison-like inn. 5. The day before Zheng and Kuang set out to board the ship, the weather was gloomy. It looks like it's going to rain. In the house with one floor near Jing'an Temple, at 11 o'clock before noon, a table of fish and meat dishes was installed and placed on the round table. In the upper body's place were stacked several volumes of quarterly periodicals and a bundle of weekly and daily newspapers. A pair of huge candles weighing a full kilogram were lit below. Zheng, Kuang, Yu, and Hua, all slightly tipsy from drinking, were worshipping there. Hai Ru bowed down, kowtowed a few times, and said loudly, The god of poetry has invited us to be feasted on, but because our will is weak, we cannot sacrifice our lives. So each wanted to escape back to his hometown to save his body. But gods of art, we have suffered a lot of persecution on your behalf. We have no intention of rejecting you. It doesn't matter if everyone in the world criticizes us, we just ask that you understand us. Can you say something for us, saying, they are loyal to art? Those of us who are weak-willed will have to work hard to disperse things tomorrow. I wonder if we will still be on this earth again? Or in the land of death? Our common work. Although it has not benefited us materially at all, it has made us mentally as tough as ancient cultists. Before we were separated today, we planned to burn our own work with our own hands. Lest he be ravaged by an unlearned tyrant. These few words, because he was very serious when he said them, made everyone want to cry and laugh. After the four of them paid their respects, a lot of quarterly, weekly, and daily magazines were burned in the courtyard. A few pieces of paper dust flew into the air and reached the eaves. The four of them stood silently on all sides of the fire, only hearing the roaring flames. September 1923. Originally published in Volume 23, Number 1, of the bimonthly Oriental magazine, on January 10, 1926. Bo-Dien. Superior. One sunny spring afternoon, because the weather was so good, I felt bored sitting at home, so I had a late lunch. I brought some pocket money and ran outside to go shopping. The clear sky in Beijing is indeed different in color from the sky in the south. No matter how sunny the day is in the south, there is always a thin cloud flying in the sky, and the sky is blue. It always has a very light white taste. The clear sky in Beijing is not like this. The sky turns blue to the end. If you stand on the ground and stare at the sky for a while, you will feel like you can sprout two wings and fly up into the sky. This only refers to the time when there is no wind. If there is a wind, people will not be able to open their eyes under the sky, let alone the color of the clear sky. In the afternoon of that day, the air was very clear and the sky was pitifully blue. This only refers to the time when there is no wind. If there is a wind, people will not be able to open their eyes under the sky, let alone the color of the clear sky. In the afternoon of that day, the air was very clear and the sky was pitifully blue. I was sandwiched among those happy Beijingers on the street, covered in the warm sunshine, and unknowingly walked to the busiest street outside Tiananmen. I stepped into a shop selling lanterns and bought some wonderful little paintings. As I walked slowly back onto the street, I suddenly heard the primitive sound of gongs and drums unique to Chinese theaters. My 2 feet were attracted by the sound and stepped in naturally. I listened to the third play. Suddenly there was a strong wind outside, and the roof of the theater was shaking a little. After the play ended, as I walked out of the theater, I was hit by a gust of wind and sand. I closed my eyes for a moment and walked onto the street to hire a cab. The driver asked me for 76 cents. Refused to discount according to the rules. Although it was not yet dark at that time, because the wind and sand were flying in the sky, the heavy earth already showed the emergency scene before dusk. The lights in the stores were all on fire, and cars, carriages, and foreign cars were crowded together on the street. A kind of car bell ringing, and many noises coming from nowhere, all playing a chaotic symphony. Probably because the night banquet was approaching, the man in the car must be going to the banquet, and the woman in strange clothes must be there to accompany him. One was because of the strong wind. Secondly, because it was the busiest time of the day for people in Beijing, I couldn't hire a car and walked all the way to Tiananmen Street. For 2 reasons: it was common for the rickshaw driver to charge a high price, but I ran out of pocket money. There were only 40 or 50 coppers in the bag, so I couldn't comply with their request, so I made up my mind to go all the way to Shidong Archway and then hire a car to go home. After walking down the footpath beside the Xingyang Bridge, I was sprayed with dust by a southbound car. My determination was shaken again. I asked vaguely to a foreign car parked by the road, "Hey, 40 yuan, can you pull it in the alley of the patrol hall?" The driver actually nodded to me respectfully and said, "Dash." The 8-year-old child, seeing that I was getting angry, walked up to the door. A broken door was closed. As soon as Cadden sounded, the room suddenly became dark. His crying mother seemed to be alarmed by this change. She stopped crying for a moment and raised her eyes to look at her child and the child standing blankly not far from the door. I took this opportunity to persuade her. We talked like this all the way, and by the time he pulled me to the door of the apartment where I was staying, it was almost dark. After getting off the bus, I counted the coins to him, but he spoke kind words to me. He took out a dark hand towel to wipe the sweat from his head and body, while smiling and saying. After saying that, she cried again. After hearing this, I felt more and more uncomfortable. I stood there blankly for a moment, and had no choice but to put away the banknote and said to her, "Stop crying. He is my friend, that paper-s foreign car. I will definitely buy it tomorrow and burn it at his grave with you." I felt embarrassed when he said this, so I should only give him 40 coppers. But at this time, I had to give him all the 48 coppers I had. He thanked me and pulled the empty cart towards his home in the west on the gray and black road. I watched him blankly for a while, but in my heart I was daydreaming about his family. He walked home. His woman must have heard the sound from a distance and ran out to pick him up. After taking out the coins from the car body and returning the car to the dealer, he returned to his room to get a basin of water to wash his hands and face, took a few puffs of cigarette, and then enjoyed a healthy night with his wife under the foreign lamp. Meal. If he is in the mood, he will probably drink 1 or 2 copper coins of bygone. After getting slightly drunk and talking nonsense about east, west, north and south, he could hug his woman and child, get into bed and fall asleep soundly. This kind of deep sleep is probably the only enjoyment for their working class. Since this time, his car and I have developed a bond, and we have ridden in it several times. He and I gradually became familiar with each other. Middle. The next morning, I just got up and was brushing my teeth and rinsing my mouth when I heard someone knocking on the door. Go out and have a look. I saw him pulling Jean at the door. He said hello to me, put his hand into the bed of the car, took out the watch, and asked me. As soon as I thought of this place, my sentimental illness started again. The onlookers saw the serious expression on his little face. With a funny look on his little hands, a few of them left with a smile. Only 2 old women, wiping their tears with handkerchiefs, were still standing there. I saw that there were fewer people around, so I stepped in and asked her. After I finished speaking, I was suddenly enveloped in deep silence. From the edge of the Kong, I heard several secret weeping sounds. If I have money in my pocket at this time, I must give it all to him to ask him to calm down. But when I touched it, I couldn't find a copper or silver currency. I stood there blankly, thinking about it for a while. I feel like there is no way to think about it after all. When I was getting upset, the sound of a silver watch chirping from my inner coat pocket suddenly struck my eardrums. I knew that if I took out this silver watch to him in person at this time, he would definitely not accept it. After hesitating for a while, I came up with an idea. When he was not paying attention, I quietly took out the watch. While saying some words of comfort to him, I took a step forward and put the watch aside. On a half-broken table. After exchanging a few words with him, I walked out. I walked out the door and walked into the alley. I felt more depressed than when I went out of town in the afternoon. I only hate that my own family is too incompetent and lacks courage. I looked up at the sky. In the deep sky, only a few stars were visible. I stood blankly in the gray air at the door for a while. Suddenly I thought of my own life experience, and I felt sad unknowingly. It was not good for my master who relied on me to see my red eyes. So I walked down from the door and followed the foreign car for a while. After turning a corner with it, I watched the coachman enter a dilapidated low house at the corner of the alley. I walked up Pingsman Street for a run, and then walked home to have dinner when it got dark. After hearing this, I felt sad for him in my heart, but I could only comfort him and said. My face turned red after hearing this. Immediately say. Outside Ping's Gate, there is a city river. Although the river is not as wide as the canal outside Chaoyang Gate, it is still full of spring and autumn rain. The green water is sparkling, and you can float your brocade sails and ride the wind southward. The ancient Shuiyang Road on both sides of the bank is reflected in the middle of the river, and it also has the flavor of Banju Suadi. The land beside the river has grown into a patch of green. In the evening, there are always idle people there tending hawks and letting their horses go. The sun is about to set. Standing on the ferry in the middle of the city river, looking to the north, one can see the Zizaman Gate Tower, which looks like smoke and mist, melting into a golden color, floating high on the river between the weeping poplars on both sides. On a beautiful day in spring and autumn, when it gets late, if you go up to the city and walk by the river alone, it feels like you are looking at a post-impressionist landscape painting, which almost makes you forget that you are outside the bustling city of Beijing. The countless peaks in the western mountains are like smiling and sleeping, with purple twilight, lying quietly in the west of the undulating spring fields, if you call them. It seems like these distant mountains can slowly come to you. There are several manors that raise geese and ducks outside Zizaman, so every afternoon, there are always pairs of white geese swimming in the city river. The last rays of the setting sun. 1 or 2 rays of light shine through the shade of the willows, and when they fall on the backs of these floating white geese, the scenery becomes more lively, fresh, and unique. I am a small person, living in the imperial city surrounded by people, feeling depressed and bored all the time. Extremely boring. Instead of running from the northwest to the south of the city, going to theaters, tea houses, and prostitutes' taverns, to be sandwiched among many happy people of the same kind, forget about my own existence, and study like them, and just run out of Ping's Gate alone. Go enjoy this local scenery. The tranquility of Yuchuan Mountain and the profundity of Dezhu Temple do not have no magic power for me, but as I am poor 359 days a year, I have no money left to appreciate their noble and beautiful scenery. One afternoon in mid-May, I felt a sense of sadness and anger again for no reason. I wanted to go to the happy place in the south of the city to find some comfort, but I didn't even have a few fares in my bag, so I had to walk out of Ping's Gate and sit in the shade of the willows, breathing in the refreshing air of the western mountains as much as possible. I watched the color of the western sky change from rich blue to lavender. Suddenly, the surrounding sky was dyed deep red again. The roof of the French church and the tops of many green trees in the distance reflected a burst of red ochre afterglow. Then the air became clear and solemn. An object within my field of vision that calls my attention. Nothing left. The surrounding objects gradually became scattered, and I also felt a kind of sadness at sunset. I shed a few tears unconsciously, and slowly, really slowly, as if I was parading in a dream, I walked home. Enter Pingsman and turn south. It is Nanshanqing Street. The first alley east of Nanshanqing Street is Patrol Hall Alley. I walked to the west entrance of the alley, and when I was about to enter the alley, several loud noises suddenly came from a broken house at the corner. This voice sounds very familiar to me. After a little effort and reflection, I immediately remembered the lanky, dark-faced coachman who often pulled me up to the south of the city. I stood and listened quietly for a while, and it sounded like he was quarreling with someone. I have ridden in his car many times. He has a good temper, so I felt strange when I heard him quarreling with others. He looked like he was in his 50s, but he said he was only 42 years old. He is usually very taciturn, but when you talk to him. But he always comes to answer you with a sentence or two. He was originally very tall, but whether it was due to social oppression or an innate disease, his back was curved and he did not appear to be very tall. There was an expression typical of a cautious worker on his face. I can't describe it. He seems to be meditating on what his existence of being abused by society should be like, and it seems that in this silent suffering, he is expressing his infinite resistance and constant struggle. In short, his silent and patient attitude makes people feel infinite emotion when they see him. Besides, my social status is almost the same as his, and I have suffered worse abuse than him. I usually ride in his car and talk to him. I always feel a kind of depression and injustice that comes over my heart, and he has nowhere to vent this depression and injustice, and I have nowhere to vent it, so I have to suffer silently. Even if I can't bear it, at most, it can only roar to the sky. One day I got drunk outside the front door, went to an acquaintance's house, slept in my clothes for half the night, and when I woke up, it was already the last quarter of the moon. I hired a car from Hanjiaten to Shidon Archway, and when I was changing cars at Shidon Archway, I met him again. I woke up in the middle of the night and was slowly dragged home from the long street, which was grey and dead, except for 1 or 2 cars flying by and stirring up a cloud of dust. This sad mood was enough for me to bear, and now I met him again. Along the way, I heard many unbearable words from him. He said that it's really hard to survive these days. He said that the price of foreign cars has increased by 1 or 2 coppers, while coal, rice, oil, and salt have all doubled. He said that the owners of foreign car rentals are really picky and have a bent bone. If a small nail is missing, you will have to pay a lot of money. He said that he was pulling rickshaws all day long, and the few dollars he brought in were not enough to pay for the renters of the foreign rickshaws, not to mention when the belts were torn and the bows were bent. He said that his woman didn't know how to run the house and was always spending money in vain. He said that his eldest child is 8 years old and his second child is 3 years old. I sat in the car silently, looking at the pale stars and moon in the sky, passing through several grey and silent narrow alleys, listening carefully to his words one by one, and feeling these pains. None of his suffering is his alone. I really wanted to jump out of the car, hug him and cry, but the bamboo cloth gown I was wearing and the ropes of education coiled in my mind tied up my sincere emotions. Since that night, I was afraid of meeting him, so I didn't see him for more than half a month. At dusk that day, I was walking home from Pingsman. When I heard the sound of him making noise with others, I felt a sense of self-blame in my heart. It seemed that he should not avoid this poor friend for half a month. I listened quietly for a while and realized that his noisy opponent was his woman. For a moment, my mood was aroused by his tragic voice, and I didn't even wait to think about it. He stepped into the dilapidated house where he lived. There was only one hut on his floor, and half of the hut was occupied by a big Kong. Although the sky was not very dark outside, inside his small house, it was already so dark that it was impossible to distinguish objects. He put one hand in his waist and pointed with the other to a woman huddled on the Kong. She was sitting there, cursing several times. 2 children crawled inside the Kong. When I entered, I saw only his standing back. Neither his women nor his children can see it. After I greeted him, I looked where he was pointing and saw a woman. After standing still for a while, my eyes were used to being in the dark and I saw his 2 children again and again. I went in and called him. When asked why he was so angry, he pointed at the woman on the edge of the Kong and said. She started crying again after saying this. I had no choice but to take out my wallet from my bag, took out a $5 bill and handed it to her and said, "Dash." She heard this. He stopped crying again and said to me with sobs. After hearing this, she sobbed and said intermittently. She raised her swollen eyes, glanced at me, nodded, and fell down again, crying sadly. I want to tell her not to cry. But looking at her condition, I thought it was impossible, so I had to stand silently, my eyes seeing her thin shoulders twitching together. I stood like this quietly for 3 to 5 minutes, and suddenly many people crowded outside the door to look at me. I felt impatient with them, so I took a step forward and said to them. After the summer solstice, it rained in Beijing for more than half a month. I fell seriously ill because I slept without a quilt one night, and I didn't have to get out of bed until 2 weeks ago. In the afternoon of the 3rd day after getting up, I looked at Jouxing and saw that the weather was very good, so I took a cane and stepped out. Because this was the first time I went out after getting sick, I walked to the west as soon as I got out. I still wanted to have a leisurely stroll by the river outside Ping's Gate, which I usually love. When I walked past the shabby house at the corner of the alley, I only saw a group of people standing at the door, watching the fun. Someone in the room was sobbing softly. I thought the cart driver was quarreling with his woman again, so I walked over to watch the fun. On the other hand, I was secretly thinking. I got into the car and was pulled northward by him. The wind and sand were so strong that they couldn't hit my face. I knew that the wind was blowing from the south at that time. I don't ride in a foreign car, but when I do, I always like to chat with the driver. I want to use my words to ease the pain of his labor, because when we usually walk, it would be less strenuous if we have a friend chatting with us. Based on my own experience, I always practice shallow socialism while sitting high in the car. While talking to my compatriots who were running like oxen and horses in front of me, I started to talk without end. On this day, I didn't want to speak, but looking at his curved back and hearing his rapid breathing, I finally felt uncomfortable, so I said to him softly, dash. Because at that time, the money sent by my family for my medical expenses had not been used up, and there were still a few 5 yuan bills hidden in my wallet. I stepped in and took a look. There was no sign of the cart in the shabby house. Only his woman was sitting on the edge of the kong, crying. A smaller child sat on the ground at his mother's feet, also crying with her. After watching it for a while, I finally couldn't figure out why she was crying. Some of the people standing with me were sighing. Some people also took out handkerchiefs to wipe their tears and said, "What a pity, what a pity." I asked a middle-aged woman standing next to me and found out that her man had been in Ningxia a few days ago. Drowned in the flood. After she died, she still didn't know. It wasn't until the evening of the next day that the companion pulling the cart recognized his appearance and ran back to tell her. After receiving the letter, she and her 2 sons walked to the corpse field on the south side of Nanheng Street in the rain and cried for a while. Later, she committed suicide by jumping into a nearby pool. After her son called for help, the nearby residents spent a lot of effort to rescue her. One day later, a philanthropist from that place paid for the burial of her man. He also gave her 30 caddies of face notes and 80 coins to send her back. After she came back, she just cried day and night. She had been crying for several days. After hearing this news and seeing this scene, I just felt uncomfortable. The same 2 months ago, I came back from the front door in the middle of the night. Sitting in her man's car and listening to his story, she felt that these situations were definitely not hers alone. I suddenly thought of my poor woman, and then of my children who were as old as the crying child on the ground. I also felt that my eyes were getting hot and itchy. I was feeling uncomfortable when suddenly an 8 or 9-year-old child squeezed through the crowd and ran in barefoot and bare-chested. He took a few coppers in his little hand and tiptoed to her, dash. After saying a few words to the 2 children, I opened the door and walked out. I have never organized a funeral, so I searched here and there, but I couldn't find a clothing store to order the paper car. Later, he found a house near the 4th archway and paid him. I want him to buy a car for me as soon as possible. He said something strange several times and talked about the origin of the watch for a while. Seeing that I refused to admit it, he had no choice but to put away the watch and slowly pulled the empty cart towards the east. Down. 2 days later, the paper car was glued. It happened that it wasn't raining either, so I had lunch early, hired 4 foreign cars, and went with her and the 2 children to visit her husband's grave. When the car passed through Shanzamenei Street. Because the rickshaw in front of me only carried a beautiful foreign car made of paper and 2 packs of spindles. The men and women walking on the street just stared at me, and the man in the car behind me, his eyes were red and swollen from crying, and his clothes were ragged. Middle-aged woman. I was whipped by everyone's gaze, and I had an uncontrollable desire to resist and curse. I just wanted to yell at those men and women and the nobles in the car with a loud voice. Although this is not much, just take it and use it. This stinky thing cost me all the 3 yuan I had worked so hard to save in one go. I went and bought these cloths for binding corpses. As he spoke, he kicked it with his foot, and sure enough, a pack of white cloth rolled out on the ground. He asked me some pleasantries while saying so. On one side, he frowned and said, dash. This is not mine, I did not drop the watch. God, I don't know why the wind blows so hard every day. It's important to take care of your children. It doesn't make sense for you to cry all the time. If I can help you, I will always do my best for you. Yes. We who pull the carts are also having a hard time, and you gentlemen who are riding in the carts are not happy either. Such windy weather is really scary. They have no idea what I'm thinking. What do I want to do with these few dollars? I just want to buy an old car for my own use. You can waive the rental fee at the car dealership. The weather is hot. We poor people have nothing to do with our bare backs. What does it matter? But she was going to buy these white fabrics to make clothes. Are you angry or not? I'm driving from the west entrance of the patrol hall alley. I'm not busy. Just walk slowly. Where are you from? We don't need any money, just, he died so pitifully. When he was alive, he always wanted to buy a car by himself, but this wish never came true. The day before yesterday I went to Ming's shop to order a paper car, which I wanted to burn for him. The shopkeeper wanted me to pay more than 6 yuan, but I didn't decide. Your master is kind-hearted, please ask your master to buy a good paper car and burn it for him. I don't blame anything else, I only just wonder why he died so quickly. I don't know if is he from Sinhi, or, you can just take it with you, we are neighbors, do we still need to get paid? It's at the north entrance of Nanshanqing Street, at the corner of the patrol hall alley. Mom, look, someone gave this to me. Sit down, sir. Too bad I haven't had a full night's sleep in 2 years. It can be said that this is caused by illness, but why can't my woman and child, who are 3,000 miles away, not be able to enjoy and endure hardship with me? Should we be quarantined forever? Is this also a disease? In short, it's my fault, it's my inability to support my wife. Ah, you coachman who thanked me and took pity on me, I am not as scared as you, I am not as good as you. Ah. Sir, is this yours? Did you drop it last night? Making clothes is also important. It is very easy to save a few dollars. As long as you have to be patient, it is not difficult to save another 3 or 4 yuan. Do you still recognize me? Where do you live? What fun are you watching? People are crying here after they die, what do you see? If they quarrel over money again today, I can solve their problem. Pigs and dogs. Brute. What are you looking at? My friends, this poor cart puller was forced to death because of you. What else are you watching? Written in Beijing on August 14, 1924. Originally published in Pacific, Volume 4, Issue 9, December 5, 1924. The 3rd day of November. 1. Because the period of living with my own woman was very short. So every time when my mood changes or fluctuates, the first thing that comes to my mind is her. Although there are times when I think of other people's women, it's usually when I'm in the mood for wine, or when I've had enough sleep and dreams, and it's hard to let go of my sadness. When I feel as lonely as a rotten nail in a coffin, the first thing I think of is my own woman, the one I cannot love but have to love. It's the same today. Such weather, such windy weather. What's more, at this time, this dusk, if my woman is by my side, then the bowls of food I like to eat and the kind of wine I like to drink will definitely be neither too cold nor too cold. Too hot is placed in front of me. And she must have wanted to hide in the kitchen because she knew why I didn't like to see her. On the other hand, if she knew that I was almost out of cigarettes, she would have secretly asked an old female servant I trusted to buy them. A can of the cigarettes I love to smoke. Put it quietly in my hand, ah. To describe these trivial things, even if I write 1,000 pages of manuscript paper, I can't finish them. Even if I finish them, what benefit will they have to me now? I won't say it anymore, I don't want to say it anymore, in short, now I am one from all over the world. Lonely and lonely, like a dull electric pole, its luster shivered in the cold wind and dust. There are no tears, no laments, no satisfying career, no confidant friends, nothing at all, nothing, 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 all is an empty heart. A heart as cold as ashes. The thunder of gongs and drums, the harmonious tune of the harp strings, the crisp and bright sounds of flesh, and the intoxicating air unique to a happy place all around. Everything in this theater that usually has a hypnotic power on me is no longer possible today. My sensibility completely faded. There are really no words to describe the desolation I felt at that time. At that time, it was not even a month since I arrived in Beijing. One day, I didn't sleep all night because of depression. Like the long night of the year. I watched the ticking of the clock and saw the lights outside the window getting brighter one by one, and a few very light birds and magpies sounded. I didn't wait for the people at home to get up, so I quietly opened the door and ran to the street. There was thick frost and snow on the road. There was a thin layer of ice everywhere. After exhaling, there was a white mist in front of him, and his ears and the tip of his nose seemed to be pricked randomly by many fine needles. Pingsman Street was paved with only a weak ray of sunshine, and the shops on both sides were not open yet. There were no pedestrians, carriages or horses coming and going. Far, far away, there is a person walking there, but is he coming this way or going that way? But can't see it. Because the depression from last night was still lingering in my chest, I wanted to go out. I wanted to cry in a place where no one could hear or see me, so I walked west towards Ping's Gate. Several shops outside the city were not up yet, and I only encountered a few unicycles on the frozen road. Turn south from the national highway outside the city and it won't be far. I found that my home was already in the rugged yellow sand field. In front and behind the field, there are piles of barren graves. In the middle of the Sha Tin of the cemetery, there are several tree trunks with fallen leaves, where they receive the morning sun. Thick frost on the ground. Each grain reflects the sunlight, and some of them emit a strange brilliance. A few tune trees have not yet shed all their leaves, and they are constantly taking off their diseased leaves. In the silence of the morning, the faint sound of these fallen leaves sounds like the earth is sighing. In these natural wild scenes, I turned my back on the rising sun and turned towards the winding path to the southwest, running around and around. A piece of blue sky bends over my head, as if there is blessing, but also seems to be there to laugh. I, so withered and lonely, should logically turn into a fossil. I suddenly block out all emotions, but sometimes I become very sentimental just like ordinary people, just like me a few years ago. 2. Since that day, last winter there was wind, sand and light snow every day. Although I wanted to go out of the city many times to find the woman I didn't know, I finally didn't have the chance to do it. Sitting alone in a foreign car, running north among the crowds of people, my old habit of introspection started to show up again, When the foreign car approached the Shisi archway, the wind and sand gradually became stronger, and the sun's rays also changed color. The layer of yellow dust and clouds that can be seen in the sky after lunch is probably about to come true. But it doesn't matter if it's windy or rainy. I still felt like this and ran home with a depressed heart. I was not willing to give in. I had better go out of Pingsman and go to Hong Mega to find out about the girl. 7. Sitting at home, even more bored, I finished the phone call. I ran out to find a place to be happy. However, in my spiritual eyes, I have put on yellow-gray glasses. Where can I see that there is nothing in the world that is not yellow-gray? It's the beginning of spring this year. It was also a day with clear clouds and clear wind. The trees had just turned a little green, but the leaves had not yet grown, and it still looked like a late autumn scene. Because of some trivial matter, I had to go see a friend at the University of Agricultural Sciences. At around 10 o'clock in the morning, I hired a donkey from Ping's Gate. After walking for less than 20 minutes, the donkey driver made me leave the westbound road and fork into a southwest path. The sun was already high at this time, and I felt that the sheepskin robe on my body was getting a little warm, so I asked the driver to hold the donkey, and I wanted to get off the donkey and take off some clothes. The donkey driver pointed forward and said. I lay on the bed, looked at the calendar, and remembered this novel. At the same time, I remembered my birthday on the 3rd day of November. Needless to say, at this time, I was even more depressed and bored than the protagonist of the novel. 3. I was fascinated by her and couldn't walk away after I stopped. I watched her take a small bucket of water home from the derrick. I remember that when she was about to enter the door, she turned to look at me again, and her face seemed to be a little red. After she disappeared from the door, I stood there in the morning sun for a long time, because a farmer came from the west, so I turned around and walked to the derrick just now, climbed up the high bank from the roadside, and lowered the bucket she had just used into the well. I looked into the well. At first glance, it seemed as if I saw her face reflected in the well. When I looked carefully, I realized it was a circle of bright blue sky. After I drew water from the well and rinsed my mouth, I took out the handkerchief in my bag and wiped my eyelids. Even though it was well water, I felt very cold. After the farmer from the west passed under the high bank, I slowly walked towards the door of her room. There was a wall of light standing inside the door, so I couldn't see what was going on inside. This house faces south and goes north along the east wall. There are 2 glass windows on the wall. It can be seen that these windows are probably the windows of the east wing. They are very bright, clean, and elegant. By this time the sun had risen a little higher, and I saw the shadow of my own house, mixed with the shadows of many trees in the sparse forest, also reflected on the wall. Suddenly there was a sound of tame pigeons flying in the air, and I was freed from my dream, and slowly walked back to the main road from a sloping path behind the house. What time did I go home that day, and where did I go from there to wait for things? I can't remember it now. 8. I was walking forward, and suddenly I saw a few elegant houses with white walls and tiles in front of me. In front and behind these uneven tile houses, there are many unknown dry trees, painted horizontally in the air. These houses are forested and have broken shores and sand dunes. They are all stained by the rising sun, and are arranged vertically and horizontally, with nothing out of place, as if they were the work of a famous painter. I walked along the way to the front of these tiled houses. On the high bank beside the road, I suddenly found a derrick that could not be seen in the distance. Standing next to the derrick was a woman drawing water. She was a 15 or 16-year-old woman. Although her clothes were not as gorgeous as those of the upper-class women in the city, she was still very neat and fashionable. When I walked to her side at the foot of the high bank, I couldn't help but raise my head to look at her until I had passed 5 or 6 steps. He stopped just now and looked back carefully. Ah. The profile of her as shown in the morning sun at this time, Marduena, Beatricius, Menelicii, I don't know what to call her. A pair of eyes with very dark pupils and lots of hair. Watch the bucket there. Maybe it was because I suddenly stopped after hearing that. This pair of big black eyes turned back to look at me. Although the flesh color is very fine and white, her kind of fine white. It's not like the woman in the fireworks in the city, who doesn't look sick at all. And that bridge of nose. I guess the word Greek refers to this type of bridge of the nose, right? Seen from a distance, it doesn't look very prominent. But for some reason, I always felt that it was sharp, which matched her slightly rectangular face. Although I was not lucky enough to see her smile, I wanted to make her mouth look the most beautiful, especially the 2 obvious curves of her upper and lower lips. When in her smile, her hair was combed back, with a braid trailing behind her. I can't remember the material of the clothes, but the look of the long-sleeved blouse is very fashionable, and the color is indeed light cyan. I looked where he was pointing. I saw a high hill, several clusters of trees, and several families in the bushes. After paying closer attention, I saw that the first house on the east side of the west pier was the white-tiled house, where the girl entered. I lowered my head again. He walked around the back of the car and slowly walked out of the alley. 5. Thinking of this, I wanted to ask the coachman to take me back to the front door and spend the night's money. The sun is setting, and a layer of yellow clouds is floating in the sky. People who have always lived in Beijing. I know this is a sign of strong winds. If I were interested, the money in my bag would be enough to pay for a night in the alley. But whether the intoxicating power of this kind of joy can rival my current laziness is a question. We walked to Xingyang Bridge and hired a rickshaw. On the way home, I felt quite reluctant to let go of today's day, as if everything would be over as soon as I got home. Probably the current group of middle-aged people who are absolutely boring and about the same age as me should have this kind of temper. All day long, from 4 to 6 o'clock, we spend more time introspecting, less time externalizing, more time blaming ourselves, and less time imitating the behavior of those great men and women. The more introspective I am, the more bored I feel and the angrier I become, and the result is the more eccentric his personality becomes, the more he wants to live a reclusive life. This introspective disease of mine is the same as my addiction to tobacco and alcohol, but it is getting deeper day by day. Recently, I am afraid that even a cough will be known to others, even when hailing a rickshaw on the road. He also sounded very quiet. In the middle of opening and closing my eyes several times, time ran quickly again. The desolate scenery of late autumn, and I don't know when, changed to the scene of the last years of the wind and snow. This morning, I slept alone in a cold cotton quilt. Looking at the rising sun outside the window and listening to the sound of wheels grinding on the frozen dirt road in the narrow alley, I suddenly thought of things such as, what year is it today, and what is my relationship with time now? I don't know if it's lucky or unfortunate. Look at the month sign in front of the bed. I suddenly realized that today is the 3rd day of November in the lunar calendar. 28 years ago yesterday, a wingless biped like me did not exist in this troubled world. And the world at that time was indeed much more peaceful and happy than it is now. Was it lucky or unfortunate? I suddenly remembered that today is my birthday. A loud bang interrupted my musings. Look towards the stage. I saw a man with a green face and a red beard dancing around. Because the plots before and after were not connected, I was even less interested in watching the show than before, so I asked the audience for a hat and scarf, and slowly walked out of the theater. Had a pot of tea. After listening to a few high notes of Tsing Yi's solo, I felt that my body was gradually becoming distant from the surroundings. After looking around again, I simply indulged in my own thoughts. There was a clicking sound. The foreign car passed through an uneven area, and I jumped up from the car seat, more than a foot high. Last autumn, after my plan to establish a career in literature and art in Shanghai failed, I had no choice but to accept the kindness of several classmates. He reluctantly fled to Beijing. This is mid-October when the poplar and elm trees are shedding leaves day by day, the weeping poplars and weeds are turning yellow day by day. At that time, after I was defeated, I was far away, and the season of decline came again. Looking around in confusion, there is no hope at all. There is no interest in life at all. When I come back from teaching in school every day, if I'm not sick and my feet are strong enough to walk, I won't go to the homes of several ancestors to chat, but I'll go out to the mountains outside the city and walk around randomly. My mood at that time was really too complicated and sad. So all day long, I couldn't calm down for a moment. Moreover, due to long-term insomnia and the unrestrained life in Shanghai, my emotions are very fragile. When I am touched, I will shed tears like a woman. I remember one time when it was snowing late one night, I was having dinner at Mr. C.'s house who introduced me to Beijing. When I listened to Mrs. C.'s words of comfort to me in a Shanghainese accent, I actually awed. He started crying. Half a month ago. Mr. A primary school teacher in Port-An, sent me a novel. The title of this novel is Birthday. What is described in it is a 21-year-old passionate young man. When he was born, he felt depressed in his chest. I just feel like there is nowhere to vent. On this day, the school was on holiday. He had no girlfriend, and no one among his colleagues could talk to him to relieve his boredom. Full of loneliness, he had no choice but to walk blindly on the streets. He accidentally met a girl selling flowers, and he comforted himself. He just wanted to have a few intimate words with this girl, but there was no way this girl could understand him, so he had no choice but to come back depressed. After 12 o'clock, I left the tavern and headed to the theater in the same moody mood. The sound of car bells and shouts in the streets and narrow alleys, as well as uncategorized noises, greeted us. I heard that during this war, the number of people who died was always more than 50,000 or 60,000. Because of the war, even though they did not go to the battlefield, the number of people who died was involved. There are thousands of them, but outside the front door, under the sun, in the cool breeze and in the dust, there are still so many yellow people coming and going. What caught people's attention in particular were the many soldiers wearing fur hats and gray and yellow uniforms. I'm on the sidewalk next to the street. After wiping my eyes, I was pushed across the middle street by the crowd of cars and horses, and then headed east to find a newly opened theater. After leaving the front door, I ran up and down the street twice and saw many soldiers wearing fur hats and swords. The buzzing people were all two-legged animals with no purpose like me. There was a procession of people playing music in front of the coffin, in the busy first hour or two of the afternoon, in the middle of the stream of cars and carriages. It was moving there slowly like a coffin. This strange phenomenon attracted my attention for a moment, but when I stopped and took a look, I found it to be bland and boring, so I had no choice but to enter a tavern. I lowered my head and thought about this. I have approached the door. There was a buzz and a click, and when I was about to walk down the steps, a person stepped out of a dark car in front of the door. I first saw a pair of narrow female feet wearing blue embroidered satin shoes, and raised my head a little higher. I saw another golden brocade and light red mantle, a cloak. One bell. Women's coat. If you raise your head a little higher, you can immediately see a pink face, but I suddenly thought. This morning, I shouldn't have done anything. I shouldn't have looked at that calendar, because ever since I remembered my own birthday, the weight that usually hung there in my heart suddenly gained 1,000 pounds of weight. After getting up, I rinsed my mouth and had breakfast. I had to go to school right away, but when my heart was so dark, I couldn't get anything out even if I went to class, so I had to call and ask for leave. I bought a seat and looked around me as well as the second and third floors. The men and women were tightly packed together, and the colorful embroidered satin fur made it difficult for me to tell which piece was human flesh and which piece was the material of clothing. Ah! I thought to myself unconsciously, Chinese people are still rich, and there are still many rich people. The civil unrest can probably continue for a few more years. I don't know where I heard a Russian revolutionist say that if we want to gain stability in life, we must choose one of the three things of converting to religion, carrying out revolution, and drinking alcohol. I am no longer capable of doing the two things on my head, so the third thing is most suitable for me. And when I wasn't deeply depressed, I often used this method and found it very effective. But today it didn't work. No matter what, I drank several bottles of white wine in succession. But not drunk at all. 4. It was troublesome to get off the car and call for a rickshaw, so I had no choice but to let him pull me back to the northwest. However, I felt very unhappy and asked, A toad is born only to be able to speak a few words. The birth of a cat or dog, not to mention in the history of the world, even if it can be listed on one's own family tree, it may also be the birth of a little person. What is it worth? So in the past 28 years, there was no knowledge. Needless to say, even after I gained knowledge, I never had any thoughts on my own birthday. So why did you notice that your birthday went up today? There is a reason for this. If you treat this world as a stage, then these pedestrians coming and going are all pretending to be Yu Meng, and this half-dead and half-alive me must be a puppet on the stage. In terms of the role he plays, he is indeed a clown. To accompany Qing Yi Hua Dan. Their beautiful clothes and pink faces make them look like clowns in comparison with me. The clown who exists to enhance the beauty of others, My misfortune and ugliness are just other people's luck and beauty. You are destined to be a clown in your previous life. I want to curse you, but to curse you is to curse myself. Yes. My wandering body can be compared to an object. Then I think there is no object similar to the half pair of scissors that is missing in the center. Yes, the half pair of scissors without the lotus petals in the middle. This half pair of scissors is an object, but because the center point has been lost, it is completely useless. If someone could tell me, your other half pairs of scissors are somewhere, your center point is somewhere. Then even if I go through fire and water, I am willing to find them and be united with them. But this center point, this half pair of scissors, it must have been used as a burial object and no longer exists in this world. Why have I been searching for so many years and yet there is no news at all? Wait a minute, no, this metaphor of half a pair of scissors is a bit inappropriate. I seem to be trying to talk about love. Could it be that at this age, I can still be as lovelorn as I was 5 or 6 years ago? Wu Yan. I want to be in love. Barking? I can't, my family is old and useless, and I am Ping Zemenlier's car. The surname is Song. Oh, is this place called Hongmega? Oh. Here comes another live pig for retail sale. Hey, today is my birthday. Most of the day has passed. I have finally been to places where there is a possibility of making me happy. At this moment, I still hold an empty hole in my chest. A heart like dust. Oh. Is there anywhere else I can go? Hello. I said, where are you from? There are many middle-aged men and women here. If these people said that all of them are happy, I would not believe it. There are probably people like me out there. They can't find comfort in life, so they come here. The smile on the face, the forced flattery, where is the true confession? Judging from my appearance, who can tell that I am the most unfortunate and lonely human being? If we talk about clothes, then my cotton robe cannot show my financial constraints. I'll look for it slowly. Find someone like me in this bustling place. The poor body is as light as a leaf, but I don't know how to support it on the golden pommel horse. Old and feeble. Lost weight. Even with my body, I'm not qualified to talk about love. Forget it, I'll just go back to Qianmen Hutong and have it all night. Who can guarantee that I won't find a close friend in this world? Who dares to say that what is bought with money is not love? Ahead is Hongmega. I want to go to a family's house there. Can you come down to Hongmega and change clothes? Gentlemen. I can't pull it. This is someone else's car. It's due at 4 o'clock. It's too late to pull you back to the front door, sir. Pull me back again. Pull me back to the front door. Is this the end of today? Does this count as spending my birthday? 6. What's the name of the family to the east? For what? It's the banker, and his family is very rich. I smiled and wanted to ask more, but I felt a little embarrassed. So I rode the donkey over there silently. After getting off the donkey, I saw a black dog lying in the sunshine in the open space in front of Song's house. There was no movement inside or outside the door. Next to the derrick in front, 2 peasant women were drawing water and chatting. I had lunch at the University of Agricultural Sciences and went to play in the small mounds of wild ponds in front and behind it. It was about 3 o'clock. I just said that I wanted to see the wild scenery, but I deliberately didn't sit in the car or ride the donkey. Walking home slowly alone. Passed by the east of Diaoyutai. There were some farmers working in the fields, but what could be seen in the sunlight were yellow sand fields, graveyards, and many uneven dead trees and their dark shadows. As we gradually approached Hongmega, my heart suddenly jumped. When I climbed up the high bank from the main road and was about to pass the door of Song's house, the black dog I saw before noon barked at me several times. I cautiously passed the door, and when I walked north along the east wall and past the first glass window, I unconsciously raised my head and took a look. Ah! This happy moment. Sure enough, she was looking outside from the window. But when her eyes met mine, her cute face hid like lightning. Ah! This happy moment. In this twilight of the setting sun. In this season of spring, in this deserted village, how could I encounter the blue flowers in my dream and the bright moon in the water for the second time? I think everyone should be envious of me at this time. After this time, I did it for various things. There was no chance to find her again. She didn't know who I was, and of course she wouldn't come looking for me. And time flies like water, and this year is coming to an end again. 9. The wind got stronger and stronger, and waves of sand and gravel rushed towards the car. The rays of the setting sun. It was also blocked by the dust and sand, giving it a miserable yellow color. I covered my mouth and nose with a scarf, hoping that the driver would pull faster so that I could get to Pingsman earlier and leave the city earlier to go up the Hongmega. After finally arriving at Pingsman, there was not a single foreign cart, donkey, or horse in the cave. There were violent roars in the air, one after another. The flying sand and stones, the scarcity of pedestrians, the pale yellow color of the sky and the earth, and the blurry pedestrians on the city outline can be seen in the pale yellow color, as if the end of the world has arrived. I reluctantly left the city gate. While dueling with the strong wind, he took a few steps towards the west. When I walked to Qinghao Bridge, I felt that my visit to Hongmega would never be possible. Unknowingly, I screamed several times to the west in the strong wind, and a lot of sand and gravel flew into my mouth and eyes. Today, the indescribable melancholy that I have been feeling since morning seems to have been alleviated a bit by the few wild screams. I stood there for a while on the bridge, wanting to advance but not wanting to retreat, and I felt that I couldn't turn back home like this. Courage. Be brave, have courage. I turned around again, wrapped my scarf tightly around my mouth and nose again, and took a few steps forward bravely. The direction of the strong wind changed. It was originally blowing from the northwest, and now it became a west wind, rushing towards my face. The remaining light of the sun also seemed to have disappeared. The air outside the city, which was originally mixed with yellow sand, turned dark step by step. When I walked past the railway track of the Jingsui Road branch line, it was so late in the rush of winter. Inside the sparse houses on both sides. There are also 1 or 2 places where lights have been lit. The howling wind above my head, the dark world around me, the long street outside the city with not many pedestrians, and my lonely body all merged together. I seemed to be walking in hell. Several loaded carriages came from behind, and every time the wheels turned, a dull sound came from the ground. Every time I hear such a muffled sound, my chest trembles. When the car approached me, I seemed to be lying on the ground, being beaten by these carriages and horses. After the truck passed by, it became completely dark. I walked slowly against the wind for a few hundred steps, and felt that the wind suddenly decreased. Open your eyes and take a look. In the dark sky, there are actually a few stars shaking there. I stood still, opened the scarf on my mouth and nose, took out a handkerchief, and wiped the dust and snot from my face. I felt that the situation around me suddenly changed. There is no trace of the yellow sand in the sky. In the vast sky, at the southwest corner, there is also a crescent moon hanging there like fingernail marks. However, the aftermath of the strong wind is still there, and the cold wind is still blowing with a few minutes interval in between. A gust of wind like this makes the leaves rustle in the darkness. There was also a layer of white dust in front of me, but the cold wind and the dust were not as scary as they had been a few quarters of an hour ago. 10. When I reached the Jiudao Temple and turned into the southbound path, I saw it in the distance on my left hand. Suddenly there was a sound of train wheels and whistle. Then came another gust of wind, and the trees shook again, and there was another sound of falling leaves. This time, after the sound of wind and wheels, the earth was completely silent, and there was no living thing around. On the uneven road, the only sound left was my gentle footsteps. The silence after the storm and the darkness of winter night suddenly blew into my mind a terrifying thought. In the cemetery fields on both sides, it seemed like someone was crawling out there. I looked up and saw a few stars in the southern sky. In the shadow of the pale moon in the southwest, there were many dead branches crossing the space. I encouraged my courage and walked forward step by step. But at this time, I actually felt a little regretful. When I arrived at Hongmega, I walked up the back path to Gaodun. I saw the small window on the east wall of the Song family's house. The wooden board had been lowered, and no light could be seen at all. Standing attentively under the window, I was trying to eavesdrop on what was going on inside the house when I heard a dog barking. Suddenly he came forward, and at the same time 2 or 3 domestic dogs from far and near were barking in response. I couldn't stand in the dark shadow under the wall for long, so I had to increase my courage and walk step by step towards the south where there were a lot of barking dogs, and found the right path under the high ridge. I wandered on the main road for a while, and when the barking of the dogs had lost some of its momentum, I looked at the door of Song's house, but I still couldn't see any movement. By this time, the moon had already set, and the stars in the sky had increased their brightness, stretching out the branches far and near in the clear sky. Each one was full of malice. The cool breeze that hadn't stopped yet became stronger and blew towards my face. I had several cold convulsions. I wanted to cry but couldn't. I wanted to run but couldn't. I had to stare blankly at the sky for a moment, then slowly found my way back to my apartment. Back in my lonely apartment, under the light of a foreign candle, because the electric wire had been blown down by the wind and the light went out, I wrote this article while smoking. At this time, my lonely feelings miss my woman. How do you envy a stable family life, and how do you feel that life is boring? I think even the most imaginative person in the world can't figure it out. What else do I want to say? Painted in Beijing on his birthday in 1924. Originally published on December 13, 2027, 1924 n. Issues 1, 2, 3, and 4 of the first volume of the weekly Modern Review, on January 3, 1925. Smoke Shadow. 1. I wanted to go back every day, but one day I was coughing badly because I was coughing up blood. Afraid that an accident would happen if he moved. Secondly, due to several reasons that the royalties were not enough to allocate, Wenpu finally settled in the front building of a dilapidated house in Shanghai. Sun and warmth. The dusty Kong Nao Tua took his lonely stroll on the road. In terms of seasons, late autumn has long passed by this time. If we were in the north in October of a leap year, it would have been a time of freezing temperatures and strong winds and snow, but this is the time in the south of the Yangtze River. But the autumn light is still beautiful, the sun is warm and the wind is gentle, and even the leaves of the 2 rows of acacias beside the road have not yet shed all their leaves. The weeds in the open space on all sides are just a little yellow in color, but there are still a few green spots on the fences of unique houses, where they greet the setting sun. This refers to the Wenpu woman who just moved out to live in Beijing last year. The 2 sisters-in-law have been separated for almost a year since they disappeared last year. Wenpu was suddenly shocked when he heard his sister-in-law's question. Because he has been expelled from XX University. After escaping to Shanghai, it had been more than 2 months since he had received a letter from his woman. He thought about the expenses of his family in Beijing and the fact that he had no money to send back for a long time, and a miserable expression appeared on his face. Fortunately, his sister-in-law was in the kitchen. I couldn't see his expression, so after a pause, he told me about the fierce civil war and the lack of information. After walking downstairs and washing his hands and face, before sitting down, his mother asked him if he had any money to bring back this time. He smiled again and said to her. Before he finished speaking, his car sped past. Wenpu stood blankly to the west, and saw a layer of transparent gray flying dust rising in the shadow of the setting sun. The sound of the car gradually became quieter, and the shadow of the car gradually became smaller. 2. However, the traces of time can finally be seen, the poplars and green bamboos in front of the villas on both sides of the road, the fading grass and the setting sun on the gradually increasing gaps in the city, and the clothing of the few pedestrians walking on the road. It expresses the decline of autumn. Wenpu slowly walked westward, turned a few corners, and saw that the newly built villa-style houses on both sides were gradually becoming rarer, so he wanted to turn around, find the original road, and walk home. During dinner, Wenpu and his mother drank under the foreign lamp. After he poured a few glasses of wine for his mother, she lost her temper again. Wenpu was already a little drunk at this time, and the smile on his face gradually faded, and his face turned a little green. A vein on his forehead swelled out. A few tendons on both sides of the face connected to the temples were twitching there. His mother continued her counting and said. Wenpu just smiled, said nothing, lowered his head, and drank hard. When he saw his mother's glass was empty, he filled it for her. As she drank, she talked even more. When Wenpu was asked by his friend, his face turned a little red. Because he was teaching at XX University this time, the department was attacked by 2 or 3 students who had been bribed. It was as if he had fled to Shanghai. After arriving in Shanghai, he originally wanted to return to Beijing immediately, but unfortunately, the civil war that continued every year broke out along the Jinpu line again. Rape, robbery, arson, and murder are all commonplace. Those things where bandits don't look like bandits and soldiers don't look like soldiers. He is vicious by nature and will never let a common man travel safely. Kwang Wenpu, who usually speaks carelessly, if he takes the risk and goes north, he may not be able to avoid being killed by the rebels at this time. The original issue of Life and Death was seen through Wenpu's eyes. It was not a big deal at all. But for the same death, he hoped to die in the arms of a beautiful woman, or he should die on a bright moonlit night on a sea with gentle waves. They were hacked to death by these Chinese soldiers who were worse than animals. He thought it would be more glorious to be bitten to death by a poisonous snake. Therefore, after being persuaded by several of his poor friends in Shanghai, he settled in the same place. Now he was asked this question by his old friend whom he hadn't seen for more than half a year. It reminded him of his current dilemma and reminded him of the situation a month ago when several vicious students chased him away. He felt shy and sad at the same time, so he just smiled silently and did not answer a word. His friends. Knowing his temper, I continued to ask him hurriedly without waiting for his reply. Wenpu still had a sad smile on his face, and he slowly followed many people who got off the boat, walked to the pier, and walked home. Wenpu's home was not far from the ship pier. He walked to the house and opened the back door. Only one of his sisters-in-law, who had been harmed by the old-style marriage and had never lived with his brother, was sitting in the sitting room in front of the kitchen doing needlework. A look of surprise and joy appeared on his plain and thin face at the same time. With a withered smile on his face, he asked hastily. After asking, he immediately rushed forward, stretched out his hand and pinched his friend's right hand covered with leather gloves. Wenpu's friend was originally a graduate of the University of London in England. After returning to China, I worked as an accounting director at Beijing Times Bank. My friend's father is also one of the many general leaders since the Republic of China. When he was in Beijing, Wenpu often went to play with him in the alleys, so the friendship between the two became very close for a while. However, Wenpu had not exchanged a letter with him for more than half a year since he left the capital and went to XX City. This time we met suddenly, on the way to Sunset, and in Shanghai where people are constantly moving. Logically Wenpu should be very happy. Joy. At least we should spend a few days having fun and drinking with him in this 10-mile foreign market, but Wenpu, who is poor and sick, really has no such interest at the moment. Wenpu took the cigarette case in his hand and walked back to where the car was parked while talking to his friend. His friend came out alone in a car because a foreign lady invited him to have tea in the afternoon. The residence of the foreign lady is not far from here. When they got to the car, his friend forced Wenpu to go with him. Wenpu refused, so his friend got in the car and drove forward. After driving 2 steps, his friend stopped the car again, turned around and called Wenpu and said. When Wenpu slowly approached his apartment, the short winter day had already fallen down the mountain, and the sky to the west was filled with red clouds. The streets and alleys near his apartment were also crowded with children returning home from school and many workers selling knowledge from XX bookstore. A cold wind rose in the sky, blowing up some fallen leaves of Paradanus and a few puffs of dust from under his feet. Wenpu unconsciously felt a kind of sadness at sunset in his heart, and he stood still in the cold wind on the street. After a while, he saw electric lights on in the oil and opposite, so he gently walked up to the front floor of the room he rented there and wanted to fall on the bed. He wanted to take a rest, but the many shabby books scattered around and the noisy sound of the city coming from nowhere in the distance reminded him of the scene in his hometown when he was a boy. Take out the iron watch in your arms and take a look. It was still more than 3/4 of an hour before 6 o'clock, and when he unintentionally opened the silver box that his friend had left for him and looked at it, there were indeed more than 50 yuan worth of banknotes inserted in the mezzanine. His calm mind suddenly started to fluctuate. Don't wait for a second thought. He stood up from the bed, changed a few clothes, hurried downstairs, and as soon as he hired a car, he ran to the Shanghai-Nanjing railway station to catch the night express from Hangzhou. 3. Wenpu pretended to smile, but when he saw that his mother looked wrong, he fell silent. Wenpu sat there blankly in that bedroom, lost in thought. After a long time, he heard his mother coming back downstairs, and his sister-in-law telling her, Wenpu heard her mention his woman. There was also a sense of sadness in his heart for no reason, as if the person he was arguing with was not his mother, and what she was talking about was not his own affairs. He just felt that there was someone speaking in front of him. What kind of man and what kind of woman are there in the world, and what kind of suffering there is in life and separation? The suffering situation of this man and woman was clearly depicted in his mind for a while, and he suddenly burst into tears. Awakened from his drunken dream by his own crying, he raised his eyes and glanced at his mother. Looking through the bead-like curtain of tears, he saw only many lights reflected in the tears, and a small, wrinkled mother's crooked face. He felt that his old mother had also been fumigated by the wine and was crying there. He stood up from his seat and walked gently to his mother's side. He put one hand on her shoulder and patted her back with the other. With tears in his eyes, he continued to comfort her and said. Wenpu listened. Instead, he calmed down, sighed, and woke up from his world of miserable memories. There was his unique sad smile on it, and he called downstairs, Mom. Only then did he realize that the winter day was getting late. The room was getting a little dark. When Wenpu heard that his old friend's rebuke did not sound like a reproach, and his condolences did not sound like condolences, the sadder his heart became and the stiffer his mouthpiece felt. He raised a pair of moist eyes and stared at his friend's strong face. He had no choice but to maintain his sad smile and remain silent. His friend opened the car door and asked him to go in and sit with him, but he just shook his head and refused to go in. In the end, his friend had no choice. So I had to park my car on the side of the road, jump out and walk with him for a while, making some nostalgic talk, and gradually led him to talk about his current financial situation. Wenpu was reluctant to say anything at first, but after repeated cross-examination by his friends, he finally said, "I can't go north for the moment. But I really want to take this opportunity to go back to my hometown in Zhejiang to recuperate, but the financial situation does not allow it." Before his friend could finish listening to this paragraph, he casually took out something from his pants pocket. A cigarette box was presented to him, The small steamer stopped at several places, and the scenery on the river changed several times. When he was far away, he always thought about it day and night, and as soon as his body arrived, the hometown that would give him fear and disgust was so close. The whistle blew and turned around the mountain mouth. You can see many houses with black tiles and white walls stacked in a vertical and horizontal pattern, clustered together along the river bank. All in all, there are about 3,000 to 4,000 families in the city. The area near the river bank looks the same as it did 20 or 30 years ago, no matter which stone. Wenpu knew every hut. Although it was past noon, there seemed to be a few late-rising families in this small county town, and the smoke from lunch cookers in several places was still lingering in the clear sky. The mountains and rivers of Fujian River are truly unparalleled in the world. If the Chinese could be a little bolder and stop fighting each other for stolen goods every year, then I am afraid that all the business in Switzerland would be taken away by the residents of Hangzhou. Everyone only knows that the scenery of West Lake is beautiful, but they don't know that it is dozens of miles away from Hangzhou. The scenery on the Fujian River going upstream from the Qiantang River is the most beautiful scenery in the world. The reason why Yan Xiling did not become an official was partly because his wife was more beautiful than Yin Lihua, but mostly because of the scenery of the Fujian River. It's enough to make him look down on wealthy gods. When she saw Wenpu, she screamed in surprise. Wenpu just smiled at her, nodded slightly, coughed a few times, and then he started to ask his sister-in-law, "Where is my mother?" During the time of engraving the plate, the night express arrived in Hangzhou, and we got off the hotel in the same way as the engraving. In the afternoon of the next day, Wenpu's clear figure was at ease on the small steamboat going up the Qiantang River. Turning around, we walked through a very narrow. They passed through a path sandwiched between bamboo fences about a foot high on both sides, and when they walked onto a diagonal avenue leading from east to west, a new model car in white color suddenly flew up from far ahead. Wenpu took out a handkerchief to cover his mouth and nose, and turned his body sideways. He stood firmly on the side of the road, hoping that the car would pass by, but to his surprise, the car suddenly stopped 5 or 6 feet away from him. At the same time, he shouted from the car seat, "Oh, Lao Wen, what are you doing here?" Wenpu usually walked. Especially when walking in the fields, like a somnambulist, his eyes are staring at the empty space in front of him, his attention is all introverted, absorbed in the unconnected fantasy, there is nothing particularly impressive in the field of vision. For example, very beautiful natural scenery. An extremely elegant building or a very charming person of the opposite sex could never awaken his fantasy, so this time when he suddenly heard a voice in the car, Wenpu was surprised, interrupting his line of thinking that he had been doing for half a day. Half a day of excitement. After Wenpu drank a few sips of tea and ate some snacks, he felt tired and wanted to go upstairs to sleep. That building was originally his bedroom when he and his woman still lived at home. The marriage was also held in this room. His adult life was wandering outside. His woman stayed in the empty boudoir, serving his mother during the day, and at night she hugged the child alone under the lamp and shed tears. Traces of it can be seen everywhere on the gray and black walls, the collapsed appliances, and the huge wooden bed. You can tell. Wenpu looked at these old utensils used by his wife and a photo of her still hanging there on the wall, and suddenly felt sour in his heart. He sat on the edge of the bed, staring blankly at the afternoon sunshine outside the glass window in front of him, driving away the sleep demon. He felt that he would never see his poor woman again, and this empty room looked as if no one had come in since her death. A layer of cold loneliness and a dull atmosphere pressed heavily on his heart. 4. After arriving in Shanghai, Wenpu, who had been vomiting blood for more than a month and had lost all his courage, was afraid of breaking his back even when he stretched, suddenly entered this situation that was more beautiful than a picture, and felt a little angry coming back to his chest. He leaned against the railing. I looked up at the quiet sky, then looked at the dense creases on the surrounding mountains, and spit out a few mouthfuls of bloody phlegm into the clear river. I felt the same excitement I felt when I came back from abroad at the beginning of the year. Another fit. But this kind of childlike innocence comes back. It was just a temporary phenomenon. When the ship was approaching his hometown, his mood suddenly became depressed again. He thought of his family, surrounded by hundreds of years of tradition, and of his old and nosy mother. Thinking of all the troubles and entanglements of the folks, I shuddered a few times and shook my head to the left and right several times. As he spoke, he opened the box and took out a cigarette. Then he closed the box and handed it to Wenpu. He took out a petroleum firebox from another trouser pocket to light a fire and smoke. Wenpu looked at this silver gold cigarette case and found it very cute. However, since the day he vomited blood, he didn't smoke very much because he was afraid of coughing, so he played with the box for a while. Without opening the lid to smoke a cigarette, he handed the box back to his friend. His friend smiled at him, blew a puff of smoke into the sky, and said softly to him, "Dash. The autumn water in the river is still blue and clear. The autumn mountains on both sides of the Taiwan Strait are still welcoming people. Some songs of Tsangjiang River. There are just a few clusters of reeds and a few villages dotted there. When you are sitting in the cabin of the ship, you only need to raise your head, and you will be greeted by the red leaves of the Chinese tallow trees on the river bank and the green hills not far from the sky. I do have money, but it's still in the bank. Then you can go and get it. This money is easy to get only from others, but I can't get it myself. You should recognize this cigarette case. It was given to me by Miss Lee. Now that she is married, me staying here will only add to my troubles. Please keep it for me for a few days until we meet next time. You give me back. There are still a few bills in the interlayer of the cigarette box. Please use them first. Pu Jingpu, how many years do I have to live? How many people are 60 years old? You treat me with 100% of your love for your wife. I'm afraid God will bless you to make more money. Pu Jingpu, think about it for yourself. I'm old too. You earn a lot of money outside. How have I ever seen you get any money back? You yourself have to be a parent. If you raise a child, you will be abandoned when the time comes to make money. Are you feeling good or bad? When your father died, you were still like a soft-headed cat. This kind of plot, probably you won't be able to recall what you want to see. Pu Jingpu, your son doesn't need to go to school. I'm hurting you. I'm afraid that when you raise your son in the future, he will endure the same hardships as me. Your woman. Mother. Okay, the rice is cold. You eat. Oh, are you in Shanghai too? When did you leave Beijing? Third uncle, are you back? Third aunt in Beijing, how are you? How is your health lately? Why are you so thin after not seeing her for more than half a year? I see your back is a bit hunched as well. Hey, Lao Wan, where did your energy for drinking 2 or 3 years ago go? What do you think of this box? Why did you come to Shanghai too? I heard that you are an XX. When did you get here? Where do you live now? I went up to the new house to supervise the work. As she agreed, she stood up and went to the kitchen to make tea and snacks. The sitting room where Wenpu was sitting was originally in front of the kitchen. There was only a thin wall with a door, so his sister-in-law could still talk to Wenpu even though she was making tea. From his sister-in-law's mouth, Wenpu heard many recent events such as the newly built house at home, while also recounting his own life in the past few months. The symptoms were slowly reported. Third uncle is back and sleeping upstairs. At this time, a watchman was passing by in the narrow alley outside their house. Amidst the sound of the watchman, Wenpu heard the gong strike twice. March 16, 1926. Originally published in the fortnightly issue of Oriental Magazine, Volume 23, Number 8, April 25, 1926. Passed. There was a cool breeze in the air, and the leaves flew down like hail flakes, even though it was a small port city in the south. However, it is also like one night that can make people feel the sadness of winter evening. She and I had dinner in a high building near the sea. The weather was very good in the morning. At noon, I could only wear a jacket. But at 3 or 4 o'clock in the afternoon, suddenly a few gray stratus clouds flew in from the north, covering the sun, and then the wind started blowing. At this time, I was living in various ports and cities in the south to recover from my respiratory illness. In mid-October, we headed south from the north and arrived in provincial capital C in early November. It happened that there was a coup in Province C. There was fighting on the East Road and the provincial capital was not stable, so I moved to Port H for a few days. Later, because the cost of living in Port H was too expensive, we took a steamboat all the way to Port M. Such a lively and unrestrained dick. As a meek and stupid person like me, the relationship between these two people that happened in half a year, can certainly be imagined. What's more, I was not yet 27 years old at the time, not yet married, and I was still very conceited about my future hopes. Speaking of Port M, as everyone knows, it is one of the first places where the Chinese allow foreigners to come to trade with each other. Therefore, the architecture of this port still has some of the characteristics of the times and a bit of medieval heritage. Meaning, to the left and right in front are the lush green bays. In the harbor city, there is also a hill, and in the thoroughfare with the sea on 3 sides, there are many gloomy-colored bungalows. Business is no longer as prosperous as it once was, but there are many wealthy houses and casinos, so there are gardens and villas everywhere. The streets along the harbor. There are 2 rows of large banyan trees arranged there. Those who were resting on the benches under the banyan tree, both Chinese and foreigners, all had a somewhat comfortable attitude. Precisely because of the sluggish business environment, these immigrants from southern Europe settled here. There is no nervous and violent look like a colonial businessman. A kind of decayed beauty, a kind of beauty that allows people to live in peace and sink unconsciously, can be felt in every corner of this port city. Not long after I arrived in this port, I secretly decided in my heart, I will never move again, and I will live here from now on. Unexpectedly, I couldn't live there for only a few days, but I happened to meet her again. In the middle of speaking, I turned around unknowingly and took a step closer. And he reached out and took her left hand, which was covered with a light leather glove. Speaking of her feet, it's hard not to love them. She is already over 20 years old, and her fat and small feet are still the same as those of a 12 or 13-year-old girl. I also wore stockings for her. Therefore, her pair of plump, tender, white, fleshy feet with very thin toes and thick heels are often the center of my fantasies. From this pair of feet, I can come up with many bizarre dreams. For example, when I was eating, I saw the pink and waxy fragrant rice. It reminds me of her feet. What if this bowl, I thought, what if this bowl contains her tender feet, then she will feel a strange itching pain if I suck them here like this. Lying down. When she stretched out this pair of fleshy feet for me to suck, she would make many real or fake screams from her two very curved lips. Or turn around and maybe hit me hard on the head. When I think about this place, I want to eat one more bowl. I remember one time, she was going out to have lunch with a friend. I was sitting and chatting at their home, and she asked me to go to her sister's room to bring her a pair of newly bought leather shoes to wear for her. This pair of leather shoes. It seemed a little too small, so I pinched her feet and put it on for her for a long time before I put one on. She became so angry that she raised her hands and started beating me on my face, head, and neck, which were lying in front of her belly. When I put on the second one for her, there were already several bruises on her neck from her beatings. When I stood up, smiled at her and asked her, "How are you dressed?" she said, "The tip of my right toe hurts a little." I straightened up and said to her seriously, "Kick a few feet. A wider kick might be better." The liveliness of the second child is reflected in her actions, words, and laughter. All the men who were around 27 or 80-year-old who lived in Mindley at that time, and who had met the second child, there was no one who was not immune to her teasing. After being provoked by this strange encounter, there were some ripples in my heart, which was as calm as a still lake in the mountains. Looking back, it was already 3 years ago. At that time, she was not yet 20 years old and lived in a bungalow opposite to where I was staying in Mindley, Shanghai. In this bungalow, in addition to the 3 or 4 young women from her family, there is also an overseas Chinese family living on the second floor. At that time, I didn't know who was the landlord and who was the tenant, let alone how the sisters maintained their livelihood. Only once. After I got to know their second son, about 2 months later, I was playing cards in their private room, and suddenly a middle-aged gentleman who was very well dressed came over. They introduced me and said that this man was theirs eldest brother-in-law. The boss saw him coming. Sure enough, she abandoned us and went to talk to him in the wing opposite, so the fourth child sat down to take her place. I heard from them that they are all from Jiangxi, but the hometown of the eldest brother-in-law is Hubei. His union with their eldest sister. It was when he was the bank president in Zhejiang. I slowly walked upstairs and sat down, ordered food and drinks, lit a cigarette, and stared at the electric light, when things in Mindley unfolded before my eyes again. I had just come out of the countryside. Work as an editor in a newspaper. The house in Mindley is the residence of Chen Jun, a friend of the newspaper's general manager. At that time, because I was not familiar with the situation in Shanghai and could not rent another apartment, I stayed at Chen Jun's house. The Chen family lived across from them and often visited each other. Therefore, I accidentally got acquainted with the most lively second among them. While I was thinking about these past events, I had already reached the center of the long street, the door of the busiest department store. In this evening drizzle. This is the only section of the street where the number of pedestrians has not decreased. The lights of the shops on both sides shine brightly, reflecting some lonely feelings. Walk eastward until the end of the street, then turn southward. On your right side stands a large restaurant called Wang Hai. There are many small rooms on the 3rd and 4th floors of this restaurant. When you open the window, you can see the sails in the sea. This is the pub that I have visited most often since I arrived in Port M. When I heard her voice calling me, it seemed that she was very familiar, but I couldn't remember which one it was. As if being struck by electricity, he turned around quickly and saw only a small gray face against the black umbrella. It was already dark at night, and I couldn't see all the tissues of her face clearly, but her 2 big eyes twinkled fiercely. And I don't know where the electricity came from, like a gust of cold wind, shaking my spirit. When we were telling jokes in the Chen family sitting room, my friend's wife also said to us, "Second brother, if Mr. Li becomes your man, then he can put on your shoes and socks every day, and he can also be your vent. He can be kicked and beaten by you day and night. Wouldn't it be great?" When the second child heard these words, he always smiled, glanced at me sideways and said, "Mr. Li is no good, he is too stupid, and he doesn't know how to wait for others. I'm quite willing to be kicked and beaten, as long as I have a man who can command me and teach me to be convinced." After such jokes, I always feel so melancholy that I have to walk alone on the road for a long time to get rid of the melancholy in my chest. It was an unexpected adventure. One drizzly sunset, I walked down from a small hotel on the hill to the west and wanted to go to the market for dinner. When passing P Street, which has very few pedestrians. At the door of a small bungalow facing the street, a woman slowly walked out of the shed. She was wearing a gray raincoat with an umbrella on it, so I couldn't see her face. It was probably inside the shed door that she had already seen me. Because I didn't bring an umbrella that day, so I walked a few steps ahead of her, and she suddenly asked me, dash. When I asked her, she couldn't answer for a while. She just pointed her mouth forward. I thought of her weird temper when she was in Shanghai. So I stopped asking and walked slowly forward with her. The two walked side by side in silence for a few minutes, and then she quietly told me. Although her figure is not tall, she can still reach the shoulders of ordinary men if she wears high-soled shoes. She walks almost twice as fast as a Western woman. He speaks without any taboos and is more frank than the daily speech among our male classmates. If there is something funny, she sees it, or hears a joke while talking. No matter whether the person in front of her is a stranger or not, she always shows her two lovely rows of white and thin teeth, bends down and holds her belly, unable to smile, and sometimes she even turns her body sideways and leans against you. Come. The Chin family entertained guests several times. Because I couldn't bear the oppression of her attitude, would always skip the meeting or go to the newspaper office. Therefore, I could not live in Mindley for more than half a year, but the Chin family gave me a nickname, calling me the second child's chicken girl. Because the second child is like a rooster. When something funny happens, she always wants me to be her leaning pillar and jump on her to laugh. And she always makes fun of me in front of everyone. I always like to retell my erratic movements and my wrong words to make me laugh. But it is strange to say that she played with me and despised me like this. Not only did I not hate her at that time, but I also felt honored and happy from time to time. When I was meditating alone, every time I recalled these trivial things, I felt very grateful to her and admired her. Later, when we were playing cards, I had to give her whatever cards she wanted. Their faces are all rectangular. Their eyes are big, their nose bridges are high, and their skin color is very thin and white. In terms of appearance, they are all equally cute. But their personalities are very different. The eldest is kind, the second is lively, the third is gloomy, and the fourth, I can't say anything. Because I didn't pay attention to the fourth child at that time. The four sisters are all very beautiful, and the one who is especially lively and cute is their middle child. Probably because they were born so beautiful, from the second child down, all three of their sisters have reached the age of marriage. And still can't find a suitable spouse. Among the sisters, the second child was my favorite at that time. The eldest brother already has a customer, so of course he should not have any evil thoughts towards her. The third child is a bit gloomy, not like a young girl. The fourth child and I were too far apart in age, she was only 16 at the time, so naturally we couldn't have feelings for each other, so the only person I enthusiastically admired at that time was the second child. I heard someone from the Chin family say, their boss seems to be the younger brother of that bank manager. The bank manager paid for the living expenses of their family of four and the tuition of one of their younger brothers. After leaving P Street, there were already a lot of lights on the street, and the number of pedestrians became more numerous, so the two of them didn't have a chance to shake hands or smile. When it was time to say goodbye, she just nodded briefly and ran down a long street to the south.